The story opens with Fate. He is typical loser with the job of holding a flag post in front of the castle walls. He's been there the whole day and complains about how starving he is feeling right now. He then notices a group of 4 adventurers passing nearby. One of them brags about hitting level 6 while doing their hunt a few hours ago. There was a merchant cart carrying some goods until it was attacked by a group of goblins. The goblins jumped onto the cart, but luckily the same adventurers were close. Their leader rode a horse, ensuring the archer was protected while shooting the goblins down, and they would take care of the ones who got close to them. The long-haired dude easily deals some monsters with this quick and smooth skill, while the huge dude did his best impression of Hulk Smash with his double-handed axe. After that, they returned to the city where Hulk Smash brags about his level up. The group then talked about dividing the spoils of battle, but that only made Fate jealous. Despite the feeling, he knows he won't ever be able to be an adventurer. His stomach starts growling again and he thinks he is useless. He's hungry, he has a stupid job, and his unique skill is worthless. Let's be fair, his stats are all 1, and his skill is Gluttony. Despite his complaints, he knows he should be grateful to even have a job. Later that day, the city is full of life. The other group is trying to get better weapons, until the announcement that the Holy Knights are coming through. The adventurers immediately hide themselves from the trio of Holy Knights. All the trio walks past, and Orange rolls over to the knight's boot. The merchant apologizes for it and tries to pick it up. However, the Holy Knight kicks the merchant away. The poor man tries to apologize again, but the Holy Knights start bullying him even more. They claim the merchant is insulting them and for that reason they should take his head. The poor man apologizes again, but the leader of the trio tells the other 2 to stop. Before leaving, he tells the merchant to not let the same thing happen again. The trio walks away, calling the old man lucky. The groups of adventurers were watching everything, but they find it hard to believe that Lady Roxy is a holy knight like them. We return to our useless Fate, who's still complaining about his hunger. Luckily, his shift is almost over until the trio arrives. They ask if Fate did a proper job to fill in for them today. Fate lowers his head and confirms he did. The leader of the trio then drops a few coins on the floor as payment and tells Fate to pick it up. Fate complies and slowly starts picking the coins, yet one of the Holy Knights steps on his hand. He starts insulting Fate, saying that he is so filthy that he didn't notice him, and as you expect, Fate is a bulleted person who has no way to fight back. His stomach makes noise again, making the leader of the trio mad. He claims that this noise makes it seem like they don't feed him. They ask if Fate is trying to embarrass the Valeric family and kick him away. The guy kicks Fate a few more times and the girl joins in. She starts calling Fate's skill useless and says that he only survives because they give him money. In his mind, Fate explains that in this world, everyone's worth depends on the special powers they got from gods. They call them skills. The trio leader claims that if Fate slacks off, the result will reflect on them, his employers. The guy then orders Fate to get up, but when he tries, the other guy steps on his face and asks him to hurry up. They increase their bullying, claiming that he needs to be disciplined for failing to comply with orders. However, a voice from afar tells them to stop. This is the famous Lady Roxy Hart. She complains in her elegant way that Holy Knight shouldn't abuse the people they swore to protect. The trio gets annoyed just by her presence. Roxy continues, explaining that watching the gate is an honorable duty for a Holy Knight, and that's the trio's duty to watch the stupid entrance. The leader claims it's also his duty to provide employment to useless people like Fate. She then asks why he is treating Fate like that. The guy twists her words and tells the others they will be leaving. Roxy walks toward Fate and asks if he's okay while trying to get him up. She uses her handkerchief to clean up his injuries, but Fate notices the way the trio's leader is looking at Roxy. She finishes cleaning him up and he thanks her for her help. Roxy replies that she's only doing what a holy knight should do. She then says that his shift is over and hers will begin. Fate gives her the pole, and Roxy asks him to tell her if the trio continues to do the same bullying. Fate replies that he's already used to it and leaves. Later at night, Fate is in the bar thinking about Roxy's words, but Fate knows that the trio might take revenge on her, so he decides to not involve her in this thing. The bar owner comes to him and asks if the trio did the same as usual. He tells Fate if this keeps up, he will end up like the last guy. He says the trio gives their employees endless abuse and brutal labor, but they cannot prove it because the former employees didn't live enough to tell. Fate ignores the advice and thanks for the meal. The bar dude then says he will pray so that Fate doesn't end up like that. Meanwhile, Fate walks on the streets and his stomach is making noise again. Turns out his skill allows him to be always hungry. He calls that skill stupid and wishes he could have been born with something more useful, not something that allowed him to become a holy knight, but something that could allow him to be a warrior, merchant, or craftsman, and that's the reality of this world. If his skill is trash, he will also be considered trash. Fate and suddenly stops and notices some thieves climbing up the walls. He starts running back to alert Roxy about the situation. Upon hearing the news, Roxy gives him the pool and says she will apprehend the thieves. He wishes her good luck and she heads inside. Fate hears blades clashing and screams until they suddenly stop. He then sees from the distance an injured thief. Fate starts to run away, but he stops after remembering that Roxy trusted him with this. He decides to confront the thief head-on and uses the spear pole to send him to the next life. Suddenly everything around Fate starts to get dark. He hears a voice saying that his gluttony skill has been activated and that his stats are being updated. When he checks them, he sees that every single one is over 100. He also gained 2 new skills, identify and telepathy. He's still confused that his skill activated and drops the pole. He doesn't understand what just happened. Roxy then comes running toward him to check if he got hurt by the thief. She notices that he doesn't look well and she is worried. She never said that, but Fate managed to read her thoughts. He claims he isn't hurt, and hears her thoughts again when she expresses relief. She then says that she will have to report the situation to her superiors, but Fate is more confused because he cannot hear her thoughts anymore. Fate tells her to take the credit all to herself because the trio would cause problems if they knew he dealt with the thief. She decides to thank him for helping her succeed in her duty and asks if he would like to work for her family. She tells him that he will meet his end if he keeps working for the trio, so he should work for her family, who would treat him fairly. Fate starts to consider the situation. Does he want to continue being treated like trash, or does he want to have a bright future by working for Roxy? Well, he then says that if he doesn't do this job, another guy will come and suffer the same. Roxy explains the Holy Knights need to guard the entrance, not other people. In the end, he agrees to work for her. He heads back home and is still confused by his status changes. He doesn't know what his new skills are, but thinks that telepathy is what allowed him to hear Roxy's thoughts. He then starts to worry about his gluttony skill activation and what's going on with his body, but he quickly brushes it off because he can now beat monsters, probably. The next day, Fate goes to the shopping street and starts looking for a weapon. However, his budget is only 2 coins. The merchant tells him off because he won't even be able to buy a butter knife with that change. Fate came to this city 5 years ago, but he could only save up those 2 coins by working under poor conditions. The merchant then tells him that if he wants, he can have the trash weapons inside the barrel. He decides to check the blades and uses his identify skill to check every single blade. Everything is pretty trash until he grabs the one on the back. He identifies it and thinks this blade is filthy and is being treated like trash, just like him. Suddenly the swords start talking. Fate starts to panic but tries to not make a scene. His skill allows him to know the name of the sword, Greed. The sword then tells him that if Fate buys it, the sword will make him stronger. The sword then calls him Gluttony. Fate is confused about how the sword knows. The sword explains they have a lot in common. Fate then makes his decision and buys the sword. Meanwhile, the trio is complaining because Roxy is trying to hire Fate without asking them. The girl wants to teach Roxy a lesson, but their leader couldn't care less. After all, there are more people who need a trashy job. The girl continues to complain about Roxy, but the guy explains that Roxy's family and theirs are part of the great 5 families that support the kingdom, so acting against her will raise some problems. The guy then says it's time for him to go to the military district, but the girl is confused. She asks why he cares so much about it. The guy then explains he wants to know about the study on how to become immortal. The girl is confused and starts laughing it off while the leader walks away. Meanwhile, Fate goes to the outskirts of the city with his new sword. The sword keeps repeating his name just because it wants to memorize it. The sword then says that enemies come and Fate starts to panic. The goblin jumps on him, but Fate's eyes change and he slices the goblin in 1 slash. The other voice speaks again, explaining that Gluttony was activated and will increase his stats. He also gained the Strength Boost skill. Fate is confused that this happened again, but there are more goblin around. Greed starts laughing and explains that goblins always appear in groups. They all dash to attack Fate, but he manages to parry and slice them one after one. His Gluttony skill keeps activating every time he defeats a goblin. A few hours later, Fate finally manages to defeat hundreds of goblins. He now has a few more skills, but his stats are now crazy. His lowest stat is nearly 500 and his strength is triple of that. Greed then asks if Fate stopped being hungry. Fate is initially confused, but he realizes that his stomach never made noise today. Fate then asks Greed what this is all about. He thought that people could only have the skills they were born with. Greed explains it's all because of Gluttony. Normally, people must fight and win battles to increase their stats or level up. However, Gluttony is a cheat skill. It steals the stats and skills of whatever he defeats. The only problem is that he cannot get experience and level up. Fate asks how Greed knows about it, and the sword explains they're the same. Despite being confused, Fate notices the adventurous group coming in his direction. Greed tells him that he shouldn't let people know about his gluttony skill because it defies the divine law. Fate realizes what this means and decides that he cannot party up, he must always fight alone. Greed then tells him that he's not alone because Greed is with him. Fate accepts those words and decides to return. Yet Greed stops him from returning without collecting the goblin's ears. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that he will get paid if he sells them. Fate starts regretting killing so many goblins, but manages to do it and get paid. He managed to earn 3 silver and 80 bronze coins and decided to get some meat for dinner. Greed stops him, telling him to do maintenance on him first. Fate still decides to get dinner first, but he bumps into a shady guy coming from a dark alley. There's a little girl with the shady guy. She touches Fate and he hears her voice begging for his help. He sees her eyes shaking in fear and the guy starts pulling the girl while walking away. Fate then uses his skill to identify the shady guy's skills, however, it quickly disappears. Greed explains the guy has a conceal ability which hides everything from identify. Greed asks what Fate will do, and he reveals that he will save the girl. The girl ends up in a warehouse, chained against the wall. The guy starts mocking her, telling that she will become a toy for the Holy Knights. Fate is watching closely, but Greed stops him from moving. Greed explains the guy is stronger than him and that he should turn away, but Fate wants to help anyone he sees suffering in front of him, especially because he now has the power to do it. The story continues. We then see an orphanage. The nun explains to the kids how Holy Laplace created their world. The old lady then claims that their god left their world and gave people some special powers. She asks if the young kids know the name of those powers and they respond skills. The nun then tells the kids to thank Holy Laplace for their meal. The kids comply and they start munching down on that depressive meal. However, one hasn't touched his food yet. The nun asks if he's feeling alright and the boy simply says that Holy Laplace doesn't play fair. He explains that holy knights and warriors have amazing skills, but the young boy thinks he was abandoned because of his weak skill. Somehow the nun thinks the kid will be cheered up when she explains that in the old times nobody had skills. At that time there was also no stats or even monster, it was a place where everyone was equal. The boy tears down wishing he was born in that world. The nun comforts the kid, but another one comes rushing in. She explains they couldn't find the girl who disappeared, so they will search for her in the city. The missing girl is the same one that was captured by the bad guy. The guy kicks the pole that she's chained to, telling her to cry and scream. He claims she will become a toy of the Holy Knights, but the girl still doesn't make any noise. The guy stops and starts walking away, giving the girl a chance to sob. She then hears some footsteps, but it's Fate telling her she will be alright. He frees her from the chains and tells her to hurry up and escape. However, the other guy has returned. The guy explains he sometimes runs into guys like Fate, pathetic useless dudes who think there's some sort of hero of justice. Fate simply smiles at the girl and pulls out Greed to fight the bad guy. The guy mocks Fate, asking if he will be able to fight while protecting the girl. He starts getting closer and the girl ends up holding onto Fate's shirt in fear. Fate thinks he needs to get her to safety, but he doesn't know where. Greed has an idea and tells Fate to back away because the other guy thinks Fate is weaker than himself. Therefore Greed wants Fate to take advantage of the guy's confidence. Fate follows the instructions and starts running away with the girl. The guy slowly follows them and tells he will kill Fate if he knocks the boxes. He then tries to make Fate angry, explaining the girl will become obedient when she sees Fate's body out of soul. Fate manages to reach the endpoint and Greed tells him it's now the time to attack. Fate then knocks the boxes where the other guy is passing by and uses them to jump and attack him. The guy manages to dodge, only taking a scratch on his cheek. The guy then starts to get serious and his sword starts to glow. Greed knows that skill will be a problem and tells Fate to strike the guy down through his weapon. Fate uses the boxes again to leap toward the guy and manages to not only cut his sword in half, but also slice the guy up while the guy is still alive. Fate asks what he meant about bringing the girl to the Holy Knights. He questions who ordered the guy to kidnap the girl, but the guy refuses to answer. So Fate decides to stab his wound and torture him with pain. After some seconds the guy agrees to reveal who hired him. It was Hato Vlarik, the guy who randomly used to beat Fate. Turns out the guy are a crazy dude who likes to show orphan kids some archery skills, but instead of shooting apples he's shooting brats. Fate then takes the girl outside, telling her she will be fine from now on. His stomach starts making noise and Greed starts to mock him. He invites her to eat something and asks for the girl's name. Sahara, she says. He takes Sahara to the street stalls and gets some meat sticks. The The girl immediately starts digging in and explains this is the first time she had meat. She then suddenly starts to tear down for no reason, but Fate understands her and gives her his share. He then takes her back to the orphanage where she reunites with the nuns. They thank Fate for helping Sahara, but he becomes confused. They ask if everything is alright, but he simply replies that nobody has ever thanked him before because he has a trash skill. The girl is confused and asks about it. Fate explains his skill simply makes him hungry. He then gets closer and tries to encourage Sahara. He tells her that no matter how hard things get, if she can laugh them off, she will end up finding happiness someday or not. Those are the same words his father told him when he was still a kid. He didn't understand them at that time, but they helped him over the years. He then walks away and Greed explains that not only his stats increased, but he also got the one-handed sword technique. He congratulates Fate for his new skill, but Fate is confused. Greed explains this is a technical skill that allows him to get tech arts. They're literally secret techniques. In this case, he can attack twice at the same time. Fate is initially impressed, but he then realizes that if the guy managed to hit the skill, he would be sliced into 3 right now. Fate complains to Greed that he should have warned him before, but Greed simply calls Fate a hero who was trying to save a girl. Fate says he's not a hero and reveals he won't have dealt with the guy if he knew about his skill. Greed then explains that battles come down to luck of the moment, so the stronger person doesn't always win. Fate then makes up his new goal to become strong enough and avoid winning without getting lucky. Greed then asks about tomorrow, since it will be Fate's first day working for the Hearts. Fate confirms, and Greed asks if he's going to show up looking like a plan. This reminds Fate that he forgot to buy new clothes. Meanwhile, in a bar there's an old man revealing the news that Sir Mason was struck down by a divine dragon in Galia. The barman asks what will happen to the Hart family, and the old man replies that Roxy will succeed, and the main problem is that Sir Mason was keeping the Holy Knights in check, if you can call it that, and the old man isn't sure she can keep them in line. The barman replies the Valeric siblings are pretty trash and he'd rather talk about something more pleasing. The old man then asks about Fate, and the barman replies he used to drop by every day after work. The next day, Fate arrives at the Holy Knight district looking fresh. Upon getting close, he realizes Roxy lives in a huge mansion. He ends up meeting her by the fountain and she smiles, explaining she was waiting for him. However, Fate doesn't reply he's smitten by her beauty. He tells her she's pretty and she gets shy. She then takes him inside on a tour and her first stop is in front of a grave. Turns out this is her father and she's introducing Fate to him. Fate is initially confused. She explains it happened 5 days ago when he met a divine dragon. Fate remembers about Galia. It's a continent dominated by monsters, and one of the Holy Knight's duties is to keep those monsters contained. She explains that it was her family's duty to contain the monsters this year. Despite being a dangerous task, it shouldn't be deadly. Still, a divine dragon that had been missing for 1,000 years suddenly appeared and her father went to another world. Fate realizes that she's been suffering for the past couple of days, but she still looked out for him. He starts to feel sad, but she tells him not to. She's the new family leader and says they will work together to make it a joyful place. Fate accepts her words and almost shakes her hand, but he realizes that it will activate telepathy, so he points to somewhere else. Luckily, the maid chef Haru appears in that same place. Roxy introduces the two to each other and she immediately starts threatening Fate, telling him to behave like a proper servant, but first they must have lunch. Fate starts devouring some meat and acting like a guy who only once in his life. Haru, of course, gets annoyed because that's not how a proper servant should behave. Turns out Fate is later tasked with trimming the bushes every day. You must keep them tidy and clean for a whole week. The other servants mentioned he should take some breaks and not overwork, but they also mentioned they always thought Fate was a weirdo because he talks to his sword, plus he behaves like a maniac when he eats meat. Fate only answers the meat part, explaining the last time he ate it was 5 years ago. The old servants started laughing it off until Fate's stomach starts making noise. They tell him they just for lunch and ask if he did eat. Haru then appears explaining that Roxy wants to see him. He follows Haru but finds it weird about his stomach situation. Haru takes him to another part of the garden where he meets Roxy. She gives him some tea and asks how he's been adapting to his job, but Fate is only thinking about his stomach. He's feeling even hungrier every second. Roxy literally shouts Fate several times until he returns to reality. That was the same name his father used to call him. He explained it to her and she asked about him. He reveals that his father died in a monster hunt. He asks her why she called him Faye, but she simply calls it a nickname for Fate, and since he's been working for her, he's literally family. The guy misunderstands the whole thing, like a teenager who just saw a girl smile at him. Suddenly he starts to feel dizzy and collapses. He wakes up in his room at night and reads a note. It's from Roxy asking him to take a day off and rest. Fate decides to ask Greed why he's feeling hungrier and the reason why he collapsed. Greed is surprised that Fate is only asking about that right now. He's been feeling hungrier for quite some time, but he's been able to control it until today. Greed explains that once the gluttony skill gets a taste of souls, it cannot be stopped. Fate is confused, but Greed explains the more he devours, the stronger he will get, but that will also make him want to devour more and more. By activating his skill, he will be destined to hunt and devour souls until his last day alive. Fate asks what will happen if he doesn't. Greed explains there are only two possibilities. He will either starve to death or he will lose control and go on a rampage, putting everyone in danger. Fate is shocked because that will make him a monster. Greed then gives him some advice. When Fate's hunger approaches its limits, it will be visible in his eyes. Fate then checks his reflection in a mirror and finds out he has a sharing and from wish. Without any option, Fate decides to head out of the city at night to hunt. He notices that for some reason all the warriors around smell delicious. Greed explains that it's because of his hunger boost being activated. He also explains that's the reason Fate's eyes are red and that it's a power that makes his gluttony skill more effective. With this, he will have better night vision, be able to track his prey by scent while also terrifying and paralyzing weaker prey. Fate finally manages to find a group of goblins and notices that his skill made them stop moving. He slices through the goblins with ease and smiles like a maniac. However, small goblins aren't enough to satisfy him. Greed tells him to head over to the hobgoblin forests. He follows those instructions and he meets some hobgoblins. He starts slicing them up, but it's never enough to free him from his hunger. After a huge hunt, he finally manages to stop feeling hungry. He doesn't want to feel like this again. Greed tells him that he must hunt monsters from time to time. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking. Fate hides and notices a huge monster carrying a human in hand. Greed explains this is a goblin king. Fate's eyes immediately change and Greed explains they have similar stats, but the goblin has health regeneration. Greed explains it heals the wounds and enabling it to fight for a long period of time. The goblin king sits down and enjoys his human dessert. This gives Fate the opportunity to climb a tree and strike the goblin king's on. However, Fate gets distracted to see the human dessert laying on the ground. The monster tries to smash him, but Fate manages to dodge its hits. He's clearly afraid of the attacks, but Greed tells him to trust him and rush in. Fate follows and manages to not only block the monster's attacks but also slice him down. The gluttony skill activates again, making Fate reach a whole new level. He now has several skills and all his starts reach 5 digits. He then sits down exhausted and Greed says that the real deal will begin now. He explains that Fate's stats can now use Greed's first level. Fate is confused, but Greed says it's another form. Greed explains that he can get new functions if Fate offers him his stats, but that will cost every single stat point. Fate refuses, but Greed explains that if he doesn't, he won't be able to use him anymore. He then says that Fate can either be strong by himself or he can make him Greed strong and they work together. Fate decides to accept the deal and gives him his stats. Greed then starts transforming into a magic bow. He just needs to draw the bow and the arrow will appear. Fate decides to test it and turns out the arrow can track the target, easily defeating a goblin that was nearby. He then decides to take the goblin king's ears and drops them at Sahara's orphanage. He hopes the nuns will be able to feed the kids for a while. The story continues the next day with Roxy trying to sneak out of the house. Fate doesn't recognize her and tells her to stop moving. Thinking she is a thief, she gets a jump scare and turns around. Fate apologizes for scaring her, mentioning she looks different than usual. He asks if she is heading to the castle, but she simply replies that she will go into town on a secret inspection. She tells Fate to not tell anyone, especially Haru, who will scold her for dressing that way. Fate promises to keep it a secret and tries to return to work. Roxy then decides to make it a date in her head. She tells him that Fate will escort her during the inspection. The two head off, but Roxy seems to be having too much fun. He tells her to slow down, but she tells him to stop calling her Roxy, otherwise people will notice her. She then asks him to call her Lexi. Greed is making fun of Fate, who tells the sword to shut up. Roxy thinks those words were for her and apologizes for being annoying. He tries to dodge a bullet and she feels relieved, explaining she's happy to hang out with him. Greed mocks their romantic moment, but Fate is tired of it and tries to throw it away, but Roxy stops him, telling him he cannot treat his weapon that way. She then realizes that she never took a look at his sword before. Fate realizes he's a big problem because someone with a worthless skill like him shouldn't have a sword, plus he cannot tell anyone about his gluttony skill. He ends up dropping the sword and Roxy picks it up. After taking a quick look, Roxy says that Greed needs some maintenance and promises to take him to her family's blacksmith. They then continue walking and Fate tells Greed that he will finally be polished. The Greed doesn't reply. He tries to check what's going on, but Greed is simply taking his moment after being touched by Roxy. He then mentions that Roxy smells nice, making Fate want to throw him away. However, Roxy tells him to hurry up. They leave the alleyway and step into the city streets. It's filled with life merchants and all kinds of people. Roxy sees some good-looking grapes and stops. The merchant proudly explains those are from the Hart family vineyard. She wants to have a taste, and the merchant gives her 2. Fate tastes one and finds it quite delicious. Roxy ends up spilling the beans, mentioning that it was cultivated at home. The merchant gets confused by her statement. Fate realizes she might be discovered, but greed gives him an idea. Fate steps in, explaining to the merchant that one of her relatives works for the Hart family. The merchant gets convinced and walks away. She thanks him for saving her, but everyone's attention is drawn to something else. The Holy Knights are coming. The entire mood of the city vanishes away. Everyone goes silent and tries to look away. They're worried, not knowing what the Holy Knight is doing here. They all think the low-rank Holy Knights have been abusing their power ever since Roxy's father passed away. Yet Fate's stomach makes noise when the guy is passing by. Greed makes fun of it, but the Holy Knight gets offended. He asks who made that noise and gets near Fate. Fate gets on his knees and tries to apologize, but the Holy Knight says he can't hear him. The Knight is about to kick Fate's head, but Roxy intervenes. She explains Fate already apologized, but the brainless dude now starts picking on Roxy. He wonders who's this girl who's trying to talk back to a Holy Knight, but when he looks at her, he almost recognizes her. Everyone around then asks if that's not Roxy from the Hart family. Fate gets worried everyone will find the truth, but Greed gives him a plan to pretend they're lovers. Fate is so shocked that he repeats it out loud. Roxy hears it and thinks it's a great idea. She helps Fate get up and tries to play it up. She says that she prepared breakfast for him, but he didn't need it. Fate tries to play it out, and they end up having their improvised romantic moment, to the point where even Greed thinks this is becoming quite awkward. Roxy is quite enjoying it and apologizes to the Knight before walking away. Everyone then starts thinking they cannot be Roxy Hart because Holy Knights cannot cook at all. The citizens disperse away and Roxy drags Fate into an alleyway. She then thinks that she never linked arms with a boy before, but guess what? Fate can hear her thoughts. He hears that her heart is having quite a race and apologizes while distancing himself. She lies, saying that she's used to it, and starts happily walking away. Fate gets down, thinking it might be tough for him to escort Roxy. He notices that she stopped by a stall and sees her looking at a red gem. She explains that she's interested in them because she's a girl. She then notices some sort of rocks and asks the merchant if those are also gems. The merchant explains that or it can have a gem inside or not. It's a try your luck buy. The merchant reveals it costs 10 bronze coins per ore and asks if she wants to try it. Greed explains that Fate can easily find out the best ones using his identify skill. Fate then tries to look at the rocks until he notices Roxy simply looking at a blue gem. He realizes that she seems like a normal girl instead of a Holy Knight. The merchant takes advantage of the moment, proposing a discount if Fate buys the gem to his girl. Fate gets shy and Roxy decides to simply walk away. He follows her and she asks if Fate has any warrior acquaintance. Fate asks about Minerva and Oliver, but Roxy explains she needs to talk to active warriors, not retired ones. He gets curious, but they're interrupted when they hear a conversation about the Goblin Massacre. Turns out people think it was a high-level monster who did it. Roxy then starts chasing the 2 guys who were talking about it. One of them thinks the monster theory is stupid because the Goblin King ears were donated to an orphanage. Roxy then interrupts the guys and asks about the details. She asks if they know anything about the roaming monster, but they don't, and walk away. She then asks Fate to take her to where the warriors gather. He then realizes that Roxy is investigating the wandering monster who appeared around the city in the last few days. You also know him by Fate. He takes her to the bar, and the barman, who thought Fate was dead, is surprised to see him alive. He introduces Roxy as his co-worker, but the barman starts picking him up, mentioning that he disappeared for a while and now brings his girl. Fate gets flustered and worried that Roxy will be offended. Greed even mentions that he could lose his head. Roxy reacts by destroying her cup, not because she's angry, but because that's what she wants to be clapped. They have a huge meal and the barman explains what he knows about the mysterious goblin wiper. He literally explains that a warrior found a pile of goblins with their ears still intact. Roxy is confused because everyone would take the ears off to sell them for money. Therefore, she thinks it's a wandering monster that has migrated from another region. The barman explains that will be bad for business. Making Fate confused, the barman goes into detail, saying that people must pass through the Goblin Plains if they want to do business in or out of the city. Therefore, people won't want to travel and it will destroy the city's economy. Fate starts realizing his mistake when an old man gets inside the bar. He thinks he's seeing a ghost because he also thought that Fate was dead. Turns out the old man also has some information. They think the roaming monster is a lich, therefore the Holy Knights will be taking direct action to deal with it. Greed tells Fate this will be a problem because he lost all his stats. Yet Fate's biggest worry is if Roxy joins the hunt and sees him. A group of traveling warriors enters the bar and you know the typical behavior. They grab Roxy's shoulder and invite her to have some fun with them. Fate gets up to protect her, but she also gets up and uses her skill to push the guy against the wall. Everyone around realizes that only a holy knight could do something like that. She then reveals her identity and apologizes for trying to trick everyone. The warriors get on their knees to apologize and fear. They even tried to pay her to stay alive. She tells them to put their money away because she doesn't want people to fear the holy knights, a group that should be protecting the weak. She reveals that she shares her late father's dream to live in a world where everyone could laugh without caring about their status. The old man then realizes that Roxy is just like her father. At that moment, Fate promises to himself that he will follow Roxy until she accomplishes that dream. After having fun all together, Roxy takes Fate to the blacksmith. Greed loves the polishing massage and explains he will cut even faster. Fate thanks her for helping him perform maintenance to Greed, but Roxy explains that he also helped her get more information about the wandering monster. Fate then gets curious and asks why she didn't know about the hunt. She explains that since her father passed away, the Valeric family is literally using the situation to deal with stuff without informing her. Suddenly they hear two voices and check the commotion. They notice that Hato is pulling a kid's arm and Roxy tells him to release the kid. The girl claims they're just taking a lost kid into their protection, but Roxy orders Fate to help the kid while doing it. The trio leader tries to talk to Fate, but our boy ignores him. Roxy then tells the trio she will be taking care of the kid and decides to question the leader. She asks why he didn't inform her about the wandering monster hunt. The guy tries to brush it off, saying he assumed she would be occupied thinking about her father. Roxy claims she's fine, but the guy just ignores her and walks away. Hodo the psycho tells both the kid and Fate they're trash before walking away. The kid then reveals he hates holy knights, making Roxy apologize. He's confused, but Fate quickly asks if he got lost from his mother. The kid confirms leading Fate and Roxy to help him look for his mother. Fate thinks that he also got lost when he arrived in the city 5 years ago. However, he was helped by a female holy knight. He wonders what happened to her because he has never seen her around since then, but we can clearly notice it was Roxy when she had short hair. After walking around for some hours, they still cannot find the kid's mother. However, she appears sometime later looking for her son. Fate is happy they managed to find her, and he gets enchanted when he sees Roxy's pure smile. Why he's staring at her and he tries to make an excuse. He says that it's getting late and they need to return. Roxy then realizes the situation and makes him promise her one thing. If they get in trouble, they will do it together. He promises they will, and they rush home just to get scolded by the head maid. Later at night, Fate asks Greed if there's a way to hunt monsters without Roxy finding out. Greed suggests he gets a special mask. Upon checking it, he realizes it's a perception warping magic item. Greed explains that the mask will make him look different to whoever sees him. Fate thinks that's perfect and buys it at the same time. He also ends up buying an ore from the other merchant. He gives the ore to Roxy, who is a bit confused by it. He simply explains that she's literally helping him in every aspect of his life and asks her to open. She doesn't notice a huge blue gem inside. She promises to treasure in and asks if he wants a year's supply of meat as a reward or maybe a whetstone for sharpening Greed. You know Greed wants the whetstone, but Fate refuses both. Meanwhile, the Holy Knights are having a meeting without Roxy's consent, where the trio's leader claims they will discuss their excursion to Gallia. Story continues at night time. Several adventurers are out on the fields. They see the corpses of several goblins and think the monster has come around again. They are not happy they were not able to capture it. Meanwhile, Fate's standing over a pile of goblins with his new mask on. The adventurers see him and they run for their lives thinking he's the Lich. They call him Corpse. Greed tells him he likes his new name. He asks him if he isn't satisfied yet. Fate tells him he wants to get his stats as high as possible before the knights come after him. At the Hart family castle, Fate is casually pruning flowers. Leading a double life is really telling on him. Lady Roxy approaches him, telling him she has a secret mission for him. He asks her if it's going to be another inspection. Next we can see Fate and Lady Roxy's carriage. He doesn't look too happy. She points out a vast expanse of land belonging to the Hart family. He asks her if their secret mission involves harvesting grapes. She tells him she wants him to see their grape vineyard up close. After seeing their grapes in the market, the carriage finally arrives at its destination and Aisha Hart, who is Roxy's mother, comes out to greet them. Roxy tells her she shouldn't have bothered, but her mother tells her she's feeling good enough to be able to. Roxy tells her not to overexert herself. Roxy's mother asks her who accompanied her. She introduces Fate to her mother as a servant she hired. They exchange pleasantries. Greed tells Fate he's relieved Aisha is nice. Aisha tells Fate to come closer. She asks him if he likes her daughter. Roxy is embarrassed by this question. She questions her mother, wondering why she asked Fate such a question. Aisha tells her she just wants to know his opinion about her as his employer. They are both relieved she means the business-wise relationship. Fate tells Aisha in all sincerity that he cares for Roxy and would serve her all his life if allowed. Roxy is embarrassed once again and rushes off to her room in a bid to hide it. Fate asks if he said something wrong. Aisha tells him it's typical Roxy behavior to run off when things get uncomfortable. She tells him that she was little, she was always a crybaby that got scared of the littlest things. Fate says he couldn't tell that from the way she acts of capital. Aisha tells him she can't believe her daughter turned out to be a holy knight. She tells him she worries Roxy's pushing herself too hard now that she's the head after her father passed. Fate tells her Roxy is a good holy knight who performs her duty well and is loved by the people. Aisha is happy to hear this. Roxy goes into her room and switches on a music box while looking at pictures of herself when she was younger. This triggers a memory of her father training her. He teaches her proper stance and sword handling. He is so proud she became a magic knight at such a young age. She tells him she wants to be just like him and be able to laugh along with the people. He tells her she chose the right path as a member of the Hart family. She comes back to the present and telling a figurine of her father that she has yet to fulfill her promise. At the vineyard, Fate joins other servants to harvest grapes. One of the servants offers him a cup of freshly juiced grapes. Fate thanks him. He takes a sip and compliments its sweetness. The servant explains how the lords and servants have worked together to make the grapes have such great flavor. Fate asks if Sir Mason also had a hand in this. The servant tells him he heard the sad news of his passing. He tells Fate they weren't sure Roxy would come around for the harvest because of that. He asks the servant of Rox he helped with the yearly harvest. He tells Fate that's one of the things she comes for, the other is hunting monsters. Fate asks about the monster hunting part. The servant tells him the current harvest time is not just for grapes, but several foodstuff. He tells Fate the monsters show up because they are usually hungry. He tells Fate they deal with a group of monsters, in particular called kobolds. At that moment Fate's stomach growls. The servant hears it and tells him it's understandable he's hungry since he's been working all day. Fate's skill is acting up. Greed tells him that his skill is hungry for new monsters to consume after consuming nothing but goblins. Later in the day, after scoring the bags of grapes, Roxy tells Fate to return to the house without her. Fate walks down the path leading to the house and sees a girl walking towards him with a huge battle axe hoisted on her shoulder. He hasn't seen the girl around there before. As they walk beside each other, the girl calls out to him. When Fate looks at her eyes, they look just like his. When he activates his skill, he tries to analyze her but can't get anything. She calls out to him again and he asks her what she wants. She tells him she came too early. Fate asks her what she means. She tells him she came for the kobolds, but he can have them. She tells him he owes her one when they meet in the future. As she walks away, Fate asks Greed if he knows who she was. Greed tells him he has no idea who she is. Fate tells Greed he's hiding something from him. Greed asks him why he thinks that. Fate tells him he's usually more talkative, but he's been quiet all through that day. Greed tells him he has nothing to hide. He says even in all his knowledge there are some things he doesn't know. Fate thinks he sounds too proud of being ignorant. At that point Roxy meets up with Fate. She gives him a bag to hold onto. She tells him she went to get some grapes for herself. She looks back at the strange girl, telling Fate she's a Gallian. Fate tells her Gallia was destroyed. She tells him that's what she heard as well. She goes into a history lesson. She tells him 4,000 years ago Gallia was a strong nation until a surge of monsters caused its collapse by eliminating all its citizens. Fate tells her apparently some citizens survived. She tells him she hasn't seen such a full-blooded Gallian before. She tells Fate they should both head to the house together. Fate tells her he knows about her monster hunt and asks her if she'll be okay. She tells him she won't be alone because some warriors will accompany her. She also tells him he shouldn't worry since she's a magic knight after all. She turns back to flex her muscles but drops her basket of grapes in the process. The next day, the vineyard is now a shadow of itself. The servants come to see completely cleared out by the monsters and they're not happy about this. Next, we see the monsters close to a stream. Fate, Roxy and some warriors are watching them behind the cover of some trees close to the stream. Fate asks Roxy if the monsters are kobolds. One of the soldiers notices monsters within a bash. He points everyone's attention to it as a giant kobold emerges. Both Fate and Roxy are surprised by the appearance of the monster. They'd never seen a kobold that huge before. Fate's mouth starts to water and he still yearns for some kobold dish. Greed tells him his mouth is watering because he's nearly out of time. Fate doesn't want to enter his starvation state while close to Roxy. He analyzes the monster to see its level and unique attributes. Greed tells him it's a crowned beast. Fate doesn't know what that is. Greed tells him it's a monster born from the accumulation of aggression over a long time. He tells him it's nothing like the usual monsters and could be very difficult to deal with. They all retreat to come up with a plan. The soldiers and the villagers are scared and don't know what to do. Roxy assures them she'll slag the beast since she's a holy knight. She tells them she will dedicate her power to protect them all. While she reassures them, Greed tells Fate she can't handle the monster on her own because she's too young. Meanwhile, Roxy tells the soldiers to prepare for battle, but they tell her they'll need until the next day to be fully prepared. She tells them to do what they must. Greed asks Fate his next course of action. Fate thinks a level 50 monster is too much for him to handle at that moment. However, he thinks he can't just ignore all that's happening, and fast of all, he can't let any harm come to Roxy. Fate decides to take on the monsters all by himself. Fate goes back to the stream to find the kobolds there. The crowned beast has some kobolds warriors guarding it, with several junior kobolds moving with the pack as well. Greed asks Fate for his next course of action. Fate tells him he's going to fight like a glutton. He pulls him out and takes down several junior kobolds. He shoots at the crowned beast, but it uses one of its warriors to block the shot. The others try to protect the crowned beast, but Fate takes them down. After taking down all the kobolds and his gluttony skill absorbing their skills, he's not convinced he has enough to take down the crowned beast. He shoots at the crowned beast thinking he can bring him down, but it catches both his arrows. Both Greed and Fate are surprised he caught it. Greed tells Fate to get close to it and fight it with his sword form. Fate rushes in without thinking. The crowned beast releases a skill which Greed warns Fate about, but it's too late. Fate is hit by the skill, but he manages to heal himself. The crowned beast launches the skill again, which knocks Fate out. Greed tries to get him back on his feet, but he doesn't respond. The crowned beast tries to land the finishing blow, but it loses its arm in a split second. Fate is back on his feet. Greed praises him for tricking the crowned beast into thinking he was knocked out cold. The crowned beast launches its skill again, but Fate dodges out of the way, but he is hit midair by a kobold's warrior. Fate ends the kobold's warrior and absorbs his stats with his gluttony skill. At this point, Greed tells him he can use his first level hidden art, but he will need 10% of his stats for it. Fate tells him to take it so they can end the crowned beast. Greed transforms into a huge special bond as Fate charges Greed's skill. The crowned beast also charges his skill. They both launch their skills at the same time, but Greed's skill surpasses that of the crowned king. It literally gives him a shortcut to heaven. Greed tells Fate the regeneration skill he got from the Goblin King has already healed him. Fate is exhausted from the fight. Fate tells Greed his skill was overkill. When he sees the after effect, Fate's skill activates and he feels like he's in a frenzy. Greed tells him he's overloaded from devouring a monster with a higher level than him. He tells Fate to try to hold it in or he'll enter a state worse than his starvation state. Fate falls to his knees and screams. The next day, Roxy and the soldiers arrive at the lake to see the slain kobolds. They see sword and arrow marks and Roxy thinks they were caused by magic. She sees the after effect of Greed's skill, wondering who could have done such a thing. Back at the house, Roxy is explaining everything to Aisha with Fate sitting close to her as well. Fate apologizes internally. Aisha asks Roxy who could have done such a thing. Roxy wrongly thinks it was the Galleon girl she saw the previous day. Fate is happy she doesn't suspect him. Roxy is happy the kobolds were taken down and they can return to the capital. Aisha is happy Roxy looks so excited around Fate. Later in the day, Aisha calls Fate to her bedroom and asks him to stay by Roxy's side to support her. Fate doesn't think he's worthy, but Aisha tells him he just needs to have a desire to help her. She tells him that was how she was able to support her husband though she was a commoner. She tells Fate that having a single magic knight parent caused a bit of problems for Roxy. At that point, she coughs for a while and Fate rushes to hold her up. She tells him her time is running out, which is why she wants him to look out for Roxy in her place. She begs him and tells him to take his time to think about it. Fate agrees. The next day, they leave the house and their carriage and head back to the capital. Fate thinks he's not worthy of the duty given to him by Aisha since he's deceiving the world by carrying the gluttony skill. At night, Fate slays more goblins, but he's still in his starvation state. He wonders why his hunger isn't satiated. Greed tells him goblins are not enough to do that anymore. Fate tells him there are no monsters other than goblins around there. Greed tells him he has to come up with something because time is running out. The next day, Fate is at the tavern with an eye patch over his right eye. He thinks he's not worthy to stand before Roxy. The door to the tavern opens and the bartender's friend comes in. He tells the bartender Hato is going to join the hunt for course. Fate surprised by this, the bartender tells his friend that Sir Hodo's way of getting some glory from completing an easy task. His friends tell him Sir Hodo is better off going for the Gallia expedition. The bartender tells him Sir Hodo only goes where it's safest for him. Fate is surprised there's another expedition so soon after Sir Mason's death. The bartender's friend tells him everything will be in place soon and he hopes things will work out well this time. Fate is shocked at the knight's house. Several knights are preparing to head off for the expedition, including Roxy and the trio knights. Before leaving, Roxy visits her father's grave and tells him all that's happened, asking him to watch over her. Fate advises her not to go because she might not return. She tells him she has decided to go and walks away. Greed tells Fate the Valeric's family arranged for the Gallia expedition because they have something against the Hart family. The trio knights are happy they'll be able to get rid of Roxy once and for all. Hato will be going for the Gallia expedition with the hopes of doing away with Roxy. The other two will be going to another city for research. Hodo thinks they're hiding something from him and wants and on what they will be going to do. Raphael just tells him to make sure he takes care of Roxy. Later at night, though Fate cannot disobey direct orders or protect Roxy, there is one thing he can do. He stands in the way of Hodo and his patrol. Hodo comes face to face with him, happy to have found corpse. Fate activates his skill. Story continues. Hato heads his very eager man attack first, but Fate is so much more powerful than they are now that they don't even look like they're moving to him. Fate and absolutely destroys these bums as Hato can only watch in shock. Fate turns to the leftovers with murderous intent and the rest of Hato's group run for their lives. Hato was clearly terrified but still talks a big game as he says that he won't let Corpse make a fool of him. He calls Corpse a monster and vows not to let him get away with what he has done. Fate then shockingly removes his mask to reveal his real identity, and Hato's stunned as he wonders how trash like him could be this powerful. Fate has no reason to explain a single thing, and Hato this is best to keep from winning himself. Hato composes himself a bit to remind Fate that he's the second son of the Valeric family, the great holy knight Hato Valeric. Unfortunately for him, Fate isn't the guy he used to bully, and Feta tells Hato show him his holy knight powers that he's so proud of. Fate checks his stats and explains that Hato has the holy sword technique, the special skill needed in order to become a holy knight. Fate wonders how someone like Hato ended up with it and asks Greed if he will be able to shatter a holy sword. Greed is confident he's way better than Hato's garbage sword and tells our boy to swing to his heart's content. The foolish Hato starts getting confident again out of nowhere as he calls Fate dumb for getting in the range of his sword. He uses an immense attack but is absolutely stunned when Fate ends up behind him. He desperately tries to attack Fate, but our boy just slices his sword in half like it's butter. Hato can't believe his holy sword was destroyed so easily, and that gives him back the other piece. Our boy is an absolute powerhouse now compared to the weakling he was before, and it is now the one telling Hato to pick something up off the ground. Hato is at a complete loss for words, as I'm sure he has swore himself, and Fate reminds him that he's a holy knight so he shouldn't want to run away so badly. Hato's chips over riddled with fear, so Fate calls him pathetic and forces him up. Fate plans to teach Hato a lesson and reminds him of when Hato once told him that defiant dogs need strict discipline. The horrified Hato knows what's coming and begs Fate to stop. Fate just ignores him and introduces his face to the side of a mountain. Fate thrashes this dude through the forest, leaving Hato almost unrecognizable, and Hato begs for him to stop. They can't believe that this guy could beg for mercy since he treats people like insects. If that wasn't bad enough, Fate's precious Roxy is now heading into danger because of filth like him. Hato makes another desperate attempt to beg for him to stop, but our boy is beyond angry at this point and sends his dude flying high in the air. Fate exchanges his stats again, so Greed transforms into the Big Bow and releases the devastating attack. It's never been more obvious how insanely powerful Fate is, as his attack has left this great holy knight without any limbs. Hato wonders why Fate would possibly leave him alive and now begs for him to just end his life. Fate has questions first, and Hato already knows he wants to know about Roxy. He reveals that Roxy actually volunteered to go on the expedition to Gallia. She said that if her life could save even a single citizen of the kingdom, then it would be worth it. I guess Hato thought it over and decided that life without limbs wouldn't be so bad, because he now begs Fate to spare his life. He promises to get Roxy Gallia expedition cancelled until his Fate not to do something stupid. Fate prepares, sends him to Afterlife, and Hato pikes the absolute worst thing to say, as he tells Fate that getting revenge Roxy's sake would be a big mistake. Fate tells him to shut up and declares that he is doing this for himself. He punches his blade straight through Hato's chest and says that it is his revenge. Fate Gluttony skill activates and he receives the skill Holy Sword technique. Greed points out that this technically makes Fate a holy knight now, but Fate knows that the capital would never accept that and angrily states that he would want to be one anyway. Greed explains that Fate can access his second level, so Fate accepts because the idea of Hato stats being inside him makes him want to puke. Greed transforms again and reveals that he can now become a great scythe. It doesn't just look cool, the curse embedded in the blade can cut through anything. This is great and all, but our simple wishes that it could cut short Roxy's trip to Gallia. Elsewhere, Roxy prepares for the expedition and puts the gem Fate gave her around her neck. Fate can't do anything about her leaving and can only watch with the background characters. Roxy tries to tell everyone not to be so sad and explains that 3 years will be over in no time. Roxy makes her way to Fate where he tries to tell her how he feels. However, he stops when he reminds himself that he is a monster and he is no good for her. Roxy knows they will see each other again and the two say their goodbyes. Afterwards, Hor gives Fate the recommendation letter that Roxy left him. As long as Fate is employed at a lord's manor, then the Valerics won't be able to hurt him. Fate realizes that Roxy worried about him till the very end, but he decides that he will reject the letter. Of course Haru's shocked, so Fate explains that he's going to make his way as a warrior from now on. That night though we find out the truth. Fate tells Greed that if you can't stop Lady Roxy from going to Gallia, then he will at the very least support her fate. Begins his journey to Gallia, and we see that girl is watching him as she says that things are shaping up nicely. Sometime later, Roxy gives a speech to all the troops joining the expedition. She states that they will all need to do their best to destroy the divine dragon that has awoken after a millennium of silence. After that, Roxy is glad to see that a girl named Miria and a guy named Mugan will be joining as well. Miria points out how this guy is just another reckless oddball looking for a chance to test their strength against a dragon. This muscled up dude can't deny that, and Roxy calms them down. Mugan explains that he actually volunteered because of Roxy's father and he just wants to avenge him. Roxy wonders if his family is against him going to Gallia, but he explains that his daughter named Rain couldn't care less and just wanted him to bring back some Gallian relics. The two began bickering again and Roxy has a good laugh as they're all becoming friends. Elsewhere, we find that Mugan's daughter Lane is a researcher and she's in a lab filled with goblin body parts. She is told that certain ones come from the attacks by the lich called Corpse, and it is pointed out that the arrow wounds aren't normal at all. She discovers that they are the magic arrows of the Black Sword, one of the weapons of mortal sin. The weapons of mortal sin are made of a material that can manipulate magic power at a high level. Not much else is known about these weapons, but Lane is certain that if they can control magic power, then they would expand the possibility spectrum for skills. The wielder would be extremely dangerous, but she would very much like to see one of these weapons. Fate arrives at Tetra, the hub for shipping headed towards the royal capital, a city of merchants where the best goods in the south are gathered. Greed is surprised to hear that Fate has been there before. Fate just says that he simply passed through, but a memory shows him getting hit by stones. Fate is then told that the carriage won't be leaving for Gallia till the next day, and as he leaves, Greed makes another one of his smart aleck comments about Roxy. Fate tells him to shut up and has to apologize to the carriage guy when he thinks he was talking to him. Fate decides to go eat some meat, and we see that some guy is asking a group of warriors for their help. The money he is offering for their help isn't enough, so these jerks bully the poor guy. Fate arrives to easily wipe the floor with these guys, and chuckling greets his old friend Set. A look into the past shows that Fate used to live there, and his constant stomach growling would always get him beat up. We also see that it was very close to his father, who was a warrior. However, Father's father would eventually die. The other villagers pointed out that Fate's father named Dean had the spirit technique skill, so the village chief kept him around. However, Fate's skill was useless, so no one was willing to take care of him. These cold-hearted decided that it would be best to just run him out of the village, while calling him worthless garbage. Little did they know that treating a kid like garbage just moments after his father died would be the perfect villain origin story. Luckily for Set, Fate isn't a villain, as Fate is now the person he must ask to help his village. Fate is clearly not moved by this guy's tears and explains that Set is the son of the village chief who exiled him. Greed tells Fate to help, but only because his gluttony skill needs to be fed and the monsters attacking the guy's village would be perfect. Fate agrees to help and thinks about how even though he still resents the people, he still has memories of his father there. They arrive at the village, but the village chief is disappointed to see that his son has brought back the useless weakling he exiled. Set tries to vouch for Fate's strength after seeing him easily defeat the warriors, but the chief doesn't want to hear it, and decides that they will just have to find warriors the next day. The chief's Lacius point out that screams have been heard from a nearby forest, the monsters are getting close and they don't have much time left, so the chief decides that they will just use Fate as a sacrifice to buy them some time. Fate has clearly had enough of this fool's insults, but Set begs him to calm down. At Set's house, Fate learns Set's wife was ended by the monsters. Set regrets growing up thinking that his father was always right and explained that he only started to get his act together when his daughter was born. Set then explains that the monsters first showed up about a month ago. The witnesses say that there's more than one and they can apparently fly. They're nothing like the monsters the village has had to deal with before, so that is why they decided to hire some warriors. Just then Fate sums across Loudly and Psychos to get him some food. Fate asks Greed if he has any idea what they're dealing with and he assumes that they're most likely gargoyles. They are sort of clever, so they start by doing probing attacks to see how humans react, and when the time is right, the entire pack attacks and a swarm. Set's daughter introduces herself and gives Fate a piece of candy to settle his stomach. They decide to play for a bit, and this could shows that she might be the final boss as she easily beats her boy in arm wrestling. Fate then begins to eat the food Set brought him but is shocked when he suddenly feels tired and faints. Sat is surprised as well, and the little girl explains that she just gave him some candy that her grandpa gave her. This silly little kid has no clue what she just did, and Sat begins to realize that his father was really serious about sacrificing Fate. Greed uses all this information to deduce that the candy was poisoned and such as to wake Fate up. There is no time for that though, as he hears screams nearby and discovers that the monsters have made it to the village. Story continues. The monsters waste no time and instantly start terrorizing the village as Greed tries to wake Fate up. He instantly gives up though when he realizes that it's useless because Fate was all drugged up. The village is quickly being torn to pieces and we see Set's father running through the streets. He's calling out for Fate but only so they can use him as a sacrifice, and he ends up meeting his own fate as he is eaten by a monster. Luckily, Set manages to make an antidote and wakes Fate up. Fate has no clue where he even is, but Set fills him in and apologizes for his stupid father's actions. Fate heads outside where he sees the nightmarish scene with monsters causing chaos everywhere. They're attacked and Greed points out that they will have a really hard time if the monster just keep taking shots at them from above. A quick check of the stats reveals that they are level 27 with Fireball as their skill. Greed is certain that they don't have a chance to wait things are now, so he tells Fate to transform him into the scythe. Fate does just that and instantly uses it on a fireball. He is surprised when he thinks that the scythe didn't work, but Greed explains that it did. Cut the magic, but the fire that it causes is a whole separate issue. The monsters seem to realize this as Greed explains that they are going to cover the area on fire instead of just attacking Fate directly. Fate refuses to be taken lightly though and uses an incredible attack that slices through every single dragon with one slice. His Gluttony skill is activated and he earns the Fireball skill. Unfortunately, the fight isn't over yet as the leader of the monsters remains. This giant behemoth is level 47 and its skills are Fireball and Fire Resistance. Greed is useful as ever, points out that the giant monster is going to close in on him to hit him with its fireball and that will be his best chance to bring it down. They heard him loud and clear as the beast approaches, so Fate slices the thing right down the middle. Another victory means that his Gluttony skill activates again, raising his level and earning him the skill Fire Resistance. The next morning, Set sadly says that most of the villagers perished, including his father, so the village is finished. As if this guy wasn't depressed enough, Fate pals on and points out that the soil there is no longer healthy and they will never be able to grow anything there ever again. Set is amazed to see that Fate can use the scale Identify and wonders why Fate risks his life as a warrior when he could easily make a living using his Identify skill. Fate thinks about how his Gluttony skill is one that defies divine law and answers Set by saying that he has no choice but to fight. Set then shockingly tells Fate to hit him right in the face because he is a masochist and he wants to pay for what he did. Of course, Fate is shocked, but Greed encourages Fate to let the guy have it since he really needs it to help him feel better. Set is actually pretty surprised when Fate doesn't even hesitate. He tells the guy to clench his teeth and clocks him red in the face. Set thanks him for making things right and the two say their goodbyes. Fate heads home to see his dad who went to go get the milk in heaven. He thinks about how bad his village was. He's going to hate to see it go. He will always have his memories with his father though, so he tells his pops that he's going to be fine from now on. Elsewhere, Roxy informed that they're approaching a place called Lanchester and she is warned about the Lord of Lanchester. The useless Mugon doesn't explain any further though, and simply tells her that she will find out when they get there. Sometime later, we find that Fate is being paid 3 gold coins to guard some guy in his wagon. The guy's worried that Fate might not be a great fighter, especially since he caught her boy almost falling asleep, but Fate explains that while he may not look it, he can fight pretty decently. This might soon be tested as a group stops the carriage to explain that the road is closed. These jerks tell the man to leave everything of value behind if he wants to live, but Fate reveals himself. Greed hilariously points out that Fate should ask for more money, and Fate points out how his greedy sword sure lives up to his name. The cart driver seems to have lost his mind as he begs Fate to save him since he has a wife and kids and he needs to bring the milk back home. The bandits see this as a sign of weakness and prepare to plunder, but a random attacks on some flying sky high. Greed says that he only knows of one person who could pull off such a powerful attack, and we see that it's the girl from the other day. She tells Fate that he owes her for the cobalt she let him have, and she asks if they can give her a ride. This girl ends up tipping the entire carriage the second she steps on, and she must tell her insanely heavy weapon called Sloth to return to normal. The girl surprisingly knows that Fate has the gluttony skill, and she calls him Fate of Gluttony, and she reveals that she knows because she has a skill of deadly sin too. She is surprised that Fate doesn't know about the skills of deadly sin, and Greed begins to casually whistle when she says that Greed should have told him. She introduces herself as Mine of Wrath, and her stomach begins to growl just like Fate does. Mine scarfed down most of Fate's jerky, so he has the bigger to stop just as they arrive at their location. In town, a guy rescues a girl from some terrifying beasts, and he introduces himself as Rudolph, the Lord of Lancaster. The driver points out that it seems like Rudolph is preparing to welcome the expedition to Gallia, and Fate is shocked since that means Roxy is coming. Greed has a gut-busting laugh as he points out how Fate was desperately chasing after her and he ended up passing her by. The driver pays up, but Mine takes some money, pointing out that she was the one that rescued him. The boys decide to find a place to stay first, but Mine is exhausted and falls asleep right there. Fate ends up having to carry her, and Greed explains that she isn't much of a morning person. Fate wonders how Greed knows so much about her, but Greed pretends to be a non-talking sword again, and as he goes completely silent. People are pretty nice in this town apparently, as some random dudes greet Fate, but he notices a strange mark on the back of their necks. Fate is then told he can't enter a part of town unless he is a citizen, and he notices that the guards have a different mark than the others. Some other people have different marks as well, so Greed assumes that it's most likely different social classes. The people don't even seem to mind, so we determine that the citizens must really love Rudolph. Elsewhere, we find that Rudolph is pretty ruthless as he punishes a couple people for not behaving the way he wants. The whole point of them acting so polite is to demonstrate the superiority of the Lancaster family to the Hart family. This guy is out of his mind as he slices one of these people up, and he punishes the other for running off during a monster hunt. The guards realize that he has done 2 executions on the same day, so his behavior is getting worse. Our group finds a place to stay, and Greed finally reveals that Mine is an old acquaintance that he just keeps running into, and the same goes for her weapon Sloth. Sloth is a weapon just like Greed, a weapon of mortal sin. Greed thinks Fate is ready, so he explains what the skills of deadly sin are: pride, envy, lust, sloth, greed, wrath, and gluttony. These skills were born by defying the laws put forth by the divine, that is why they are called the skills of deadly sin and weapons of mortal sin. Among them, gluttony is particularly sinful for having the potential to disrupt the limits of the divine system of leveling. Fate thinks about how once gluttony tastes souls, there's no stopping it, and that's his punishment. Greed points out that they all have to pay him one way or another, and the same goes for Mine. Fate still can't understand why he was the one that ended up with this skill. He always got mocked, made a fool of for a useless skill that just makes him hungry all the time, and just when he thought he gained some power, it turned out that he needs to keep killing to survive. Fate gets upset as he wonders what good is such a power, but Greed just seems to calm down. Emotional disturbance is never a good thing, but it could be extremely costly for Fate. This is because if Fate's mind isn't strong, gluttony will take it over in an instant. For this reason, Fate needs to get strong enough to resist. Greed reveals that the trick is to sustain a state of near starvation, so Fate instantly wants to go practice. To do this, they head outside. Greed tells them not to satisfy gluttony all at once, and the goal is to get his fill slowly. Their prey this time as a sandman, so Greed has Fate cast the fireball spell before he fires his arrow. This arrow does insane amounts of damage as the giant monster is instantly evaporated. Fate's gluttony skill consumes the monster's soul, but like always, it begins to desperately crave more. More Sandmen appear, causing Fate's hunger to grow so much that it causes them physical pain, but Greed reminds him to hang in there. Fate can barely fight back the urge to devour more souls, and he realizes that he has a long night ahead of him. Back at the end, Mine wakes up starving and finds a poster that states that whoever defeats the sand golem will be rewarded. A mysterious man explains that not even Sir Rudolph can slay the sand golem, but if it isn't defeated, only death awaits. Fate eliminates another sandman, but he has gotten the hang of controlling the hunger between souls. It's not easy though, as he compares it to only drinking 1 cup of water at a time in a desert. They're done training for the night, so it's time to finally satisfy Gluttony. The timing works out perfectly as Fate smells the scent of a crowned beast nearby, and it will make a fine main dish for the night. We see that his main dish is the sand golem, and it's attacking some people. Fate arrives to claim the beast for himself, but the people clearly don't know who they're talking to, as they tell him that he won't be able to beat the thing on his own. Greed wonders if Fate is playing hero again, but our boy says he isn't and he's just getting his fill. This giant sand thing is an insane level 60 and it shows its powerful attack, but Fate counters it with his fire arrow. The arrow lands, but Fate is pushed back and this thing uses its sandstorm attack. The all-knowing Greed wants that once it pulls Fate in, it will crush them with rocks, so Fate decides that he will just have to cut through the monster and its spell. He transforms Greed into the scythe to do just that and prepares to finish it off. The monster's chorus escapes into the sand, so Fate switches to the big bow. Greed explains that he will need 20% of Fate's stats this time to get to the core, so Fate agrees and throws some fire on top of all that as well. This new attack is so powerful that it not only destroys the core but it erupts from the surface, and Fate Gluttony scale steals the sandstorm attack. The people he rescued are amazed by the performance, as they have never seen anyone with such power, but point out that Fate is a bit shady looking. They introduce themselves and Fate just goes with his given nickname to introduce himself as Corpse. The group is surprised to see that Fate hardly has any equipment, so he asked Greed if he should get some. Greed points out that Fate doesn't need it at all. He has the ability to steal enemy skills and increase his own stats. Normal people can't do that, so they're the ones that need equipment. The next morning, Mine prepares to hunt the sand golem and becomes furious when they reveals that he already took it down. Fate goes to collect the reward, but Mine thinks he is lame for wearing a mask. Fate explains that he defeated the beast as Corpse, so he had to collect the reward as Corpse too. Just then Rudolph arrives to greet the man who defeated the sand golem. He says that Corpse will be serving him from now on and he has no right to refuse. Fate is a bit confused, but the guy says that he has no choice, since when the Holy Knight makes a decision others must simply obey. Mine isn't having any of it though and explains that Corpse was hers first. Rudolph disrespects this girl and tells her to go home to her mommy, but Mine teaches him a lesson by sending him out a brand new exit in the building. Fate instantly realizes that this will be a huge problem for them and decides that they need to get out of town while they have a chance. The story continues. While on their way, Fate asks if Mine isn't actually Gluttony because she's always hungry, but she simply replies that anger burns lots of calories. Fate then mentions that despite eating a lot, Mine doesn't grow at all, but that only angers her and she increases the weight of her weapon. In the end, that ends up breaking the carriage wheel and they're forced to make a stop. Fate apologizes for what happened, but he then notices Mine is missing. He notices a village nearby. Realizing she must have gone there, he chases her, noticing how peaceful the village is. Greed explains the village is near Gallia, which usually has active monsters around, so he concludes there must be someone strong who protects this village. Fate then asks about the castle near the village. Greed replies it's the Hausen Castle. He continues walking deeper into the village until he notices a guy cleaning up his sword. He decides to ask this guy for the village chief's location, mentioning he would like to stay here for the night. The guy turns around, revealing to be an old man and the village chief. Greed notices the old man is holding a holy sword and concludes he's the one protecting the village. Before deciding if he will let Fate stay, the old man asks him for a duel. Fate tries to check the old man's stats, but he notices the usage of appraisal. The old man gets curious, mentioning that despite Fate being level 1, but all his stats are over 2 million. Fate is confused because he never noticed the old man used appraisal. However, the man simply asks if Fate accepts or not. Fate unshed his sword and the two engage in a battle. The duel is even until Fate decides to finish it quickly, but the old man blocks his attack and manages to disarm him. Fate accepts defeat and thinks he cannot stay overnight. The old man, however, simply mentions this is destiny and allows him to stay. Fate is confused, but the old man has a condition. Fate must take some lessons from him, but the old man doesn't mention why. Greed and Fate think this is pretty suspicious. The old man, however, starts mentioning everything Fate is bad at. He doesn't know how to counter appraisal, nor how to use his skills in a proper way. He simply claims that Fate's body isn't still used to his power. Despite being able to beat monsters, he won't be able to beat people who attack him. The old man mentions Fate could learn a lot from him, but Greed still thinks this is pretty suspicious. However, Fate knows how rare it is for a holy knight to teach someone in person. He accepts the deal and introduces himself. The old man introduces himself as Aaron Barbados. Mine suddenly appears and Aaron can tell she's a skilled warrior just by looking at her. Fate is ready for his training except that it is hand-to-hand combat. Aaron explains this is the best method to control all the stats Fate has. Aaron says that warriors who suddenly get stronger have problems controlling their power. Fate considers him a smart man and gets ready to start. Aaron starts by correcting Fate's posture. He then teaches Fate how to hit and how much force to use. He demonstrates how it's done, surprising Fate with his speed, and Aaron mentions it's all about how he controls his own body. If he cannot control his movements will be weak and slow. Fate gets motivated with the lesson and they continue their lesson. Despite all tries, he still cannot land a hit on Aaron. Suddenly his gluttony starts acting up, making Aaron confused. He asks Fate why has his eye changed color. However, the skill starts taking over Fate's body and attacks Aaron. The old man manages to dodge, impressed that Fate improved in an instant. Aaron tries to be a bit more serious and attacks, but Gluttony makes Fate watch the old man move and slow. He manages to avoid the combo attack, impressing Greed. Fate manages to move quickly despite his half-starvation mode. Later, Aaron tells Fate he will teach him how to fight in a real battle tomorrow. Fate agrees, but he suddenly smells some monsters coming from the castle. He wonders if there are monsters inside it, until he hears Aaron scream from his house. Fate rushes to his aid, but turns out Mine fell asleep after raiding Aaron's kitchen. Fate apologizes, but Aaron gets out to getting some food for them. While he does it, Fate finds a frame with Aaron's family picture. Greed mentions that Aaron's son looks a lot like Fate. He guessed that Aaron had a reason why he became the village chief and why he wanted to train him. The next day, Aaron gives Fate a stick and tells him to stop his sword. Fate is confused because it will break, but Aaron replies that Fate can do it because he trained with him. Aaron then attacks, forcing Fate to use his half-starvation state to predict the movement of the sword and let it slide on the stick. He manages to do it, making Aaron proud because Fate can now control his stats. Fate thanks him for all the help and they wait for nighttime during dinner. Fate tells Aaron they will leave the next morning. However, Mine is more interested in eating than tanking the old man. Aaron tells them to enjoy the food, but Mine reveals she cannot feel its taste. Fate is confused, but Greed explains it's the cost for having the Wrath skill. Mine says she doesn't care about it because she has something to do. That reminds Fate of his mission to help Roxy. The old man gets touched by those words and looks to the castle. Fate asks if there's something there and Aaron decides to explain 15 years ago that castle used to be his. He explains that he was away to perform some kingdom's duties when his territory was attacked by a lich. He lost all his family and people and now, the castle is being ruled by the Lich Lord. He claims that his family is still trapped inside, but that story only triggers the gluttony skill. Fate steps outside and looks toward the castle. Aaron follows him, saying that if Fate goes to the castle he will go with him. He explains that he's still stuck in the past and he wants to break away from it. Mine also appears, mentioning she will stay to protect the village, that's if they pay her 50 gold. The two decide to go in, but the dark castle suddenly lights up. The fountain suddenly starts working and they can hear the voices of people laughing. Fate uses his petrification arrow combined with sandstorm magic to turn skeleton guards into statues. They easily infiltrate the castle and Aaron mentions that what Fate just used is hard to master, but more skeletons appear and surround them. Aaron uses his sword to deal with the closest ones, while Fate uses his previous technique. They quickly get in and step inside of the second floor where the lich should be, but upon getting there they see a room filled with maids and Aaron's son. Aaron's wife and maids welcome him back, but he cannot believe what's going on. He calls them by their names and approaches them, asking if they are still alive. They reply that he must be tired and asked if he managed to fulfill his duty. He confirms and they all smile. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that despite looking alive, everyone inside the room is already dead. He reveals this is an illusion, but Aaron doesn't seem to notice. Aaron's son asks if his dad bought something for him and the old man tries to take it off from his jacket. His son suddenly tries to stab him and pulls a knife to block him. The son then backs away, mentioning he's been protecting the castle in place of his father for years. The illusion tries to guilt trip Armados into focusing on his work. When they were attacked, the illusions claim to still be alive and that Aaron wants to kill them, but Fate tells the old man that he will deal with the illusions. Fate wants to use Greed side mode to cut through the whole illusion skill, but Greed replies everyone will be also cut with. That means that everyone's souls will be consumed by gluttony and life forever in suffering. Fate hesitates because doesn't want them to have that destiny. Eren then asks him to deal with Lich Lord while he deals with his own family. The old man duels with his son, impressed by how strong he has become. Meanwhile, follows the smell of monsters and finds himself in a hall. He easily finds the Lich and uses Green's bull mode to shoot it. However, the Lich is still up and kicking. Fate looks into his stats all over the 2 million mark. The Lich then attacks, but Fate decides to control his power just as Eren has taught him. He follows up from a parry and destroys the Lich's hands. However, the monster doesn't give up and starts manipulating dead bodies. Fate hears the bodies asking to be saved, but he cannot attack them. He then looks behind and sees the bodies near him. Luckily, Eren arrives in time and slices their tendons. He then sees the body of his late wife saying the same thing she did when they last saw each other. He remembers his family asking why he always had to take the most dangerous missions, but Eren simply replied he was going to quickly deal with in return. Eren realizes he wasn't quick enough, but now he must put them to rest. He uses his Grand Cost skill to purify the bodies and defeat the Lich, but the monster is still resisting. Fate looks around and sees the sword of Eren's son. He picks it up, wanting to help the old man, and they cross their swords to activate the same skill. It's a lot more powerful and the Lich is defeated. Eren retrieves his family's bodies, apologizing for the time it took him to do it. He suddenly sees their ghost and his son tells him it's okay because he just saved, but Eren isn't sure about it. He could have decided to do it earlier, or even be there when the Lich attacked. He apologizes for making them suffer, but they simply ask him to do what he always believed. He promises the two that he will live in a way that won't bring them shame. He then gives his son the souvenir he always promised and embraces the two before everyone disappears. The house then returns to complete darkness and Eren asks his family to wait for him. They step outside and Eren suddenly reveals that he has broken his level limits. He thinks it's because he was fighting with Fate. Greed confirms, mentioning that can only happen to people who open their hearts to deadly sin skill users. However, their attention quickly turns to their surroundings as there are quite a few skeletons around. Fate tells them they should compete to see who defeats the most and Eren agrees. The two only return in the morning, which annoyed Mine because she was up all night to protect the village. Eren simply pulls a bag of gold coins and gives it to her. She takes it, but Fate thinks she's greedy. Mine replies she needs gold to rebuild the village and gold never lies, which is something he will learn his lives long enough. Fate is confused, but Eren mentions he has seen Mine before. Turns out he saw her 50 years ago when monsters appeared in that area. Fate is surprised, but Eren mentions she still looks the same, but at that time she was already a perfect warrior. Mine thanked him for the complete, stating that he could reach her level if he trains for 1,000 years. Eren then asks who she is, but Mine replies that she's a ghost who isn't allowed to die. Eren then notices that Fate's eye has returned to normal. Fate explains that he has a condition that needs him to kill monsters from time to time, if not his eyes will become red. Eren quickly guesses that if he doesn't kill the monsters he will lose his mind, so he tells Fate to return to him when he finishes doing what he needs to. He mentions that he has something important to tell them, but cannot do it now. Meanwhile, the two members of the Trio of Dumbness are all hyped up because they found the Philosopher's Stone. As usual, it is something that can cure any injury or disease and somehow grant immortality. Their butler knocks on the door and Bull Haircut asks about Hodo. The butler replies he's now known as Death and that corpse is not a monster but a person. Story continues. On their way, Fate is still complaining about Mine's ability to be a glutton. Once again, she replies that anger burns lots of calories. She tries to share with him, explaining she doesn't want him to be mad at her. She even treats him like a child, feeding him beef jerky and patting his head. Greed is laughing at this, but Fate notices Mine sitting by his side and then resting her head on his thigh. He asks her what she's doing, but she simply replies that this is the best bed in the carriage. Despite being so she quickly falls asleep and Fate compares her with a child. He then remembers she said she was a ghost who wasn't allowed to die, and that she has something to do. He asks Greed what Mine is fighting against, but Greed doesn't reply. Fate complains, but Greed simply answers that he will see it if he stays with her. Still, Fate thinks this will become troublesome in the future. Meanwhile, Roxy's companions ask when they should be getting to Gallia. Roxy replies it's literally just around the corner. Few minutes later they arrive at Eren Barbato's village. They talk about the castle and the story that now a lich monster rules it. They decide to get closer to the castle, but notice there is no monsters. Mugen thinks they cleared this place recently. Eren arrives to introduce himself and Mugen shows his respect, mentioning Eren is known as the Sword Saint. Roxy tries to introduce herself, but Eren mentions she has grown well. She's initially confused, but Eren replies he knew her parents, that they asked him to name her. She's surprised to hear that, but Mugen mentions how he envy because she has a hero as a godfather. Eren corrects them, mentioning he's a former hero. He mentions that he retired because he lost his reason to fight due to losing his family. Roxy then mentions that he managed to defeat the Lich Lord, but Eren replies he didn't do it alone. He simply mentions it's all thanks to a person who fought alongside him. Mugen mentions the person should be a strong warrior because it's not easy to defeat a crown monster. Miria also says that she wants to meet him, but Eren simply replies that he left on his journey. Roxy asks for the warrior's name because she will need to report the situation later. However, Eren refused to say it's Fate. This is because Fate asked him to not mention his name to anyone who asks for him. Roxy accepts this answer and apologizes for disturbing him. She decides to leave and Eren asks if she's heading to Gallia. She's surprised because she never mentioned it. Eren replies that's the only reason why she would be in this place. He asks if Lyric is behind her mission, but she replies that she volunteered. He tells her that this is all planned because both Hart and Eren families are threats to the Lyric. Roxy replies she will carry her father's wishes and protect people. Eren is shocked to hear that her father passed away. Due to the current situation, Eren asks if she wants to take lessons from. She's confused, but he promises to teach her how to fight in Gallia. She accepts to learn from him and Eren is impressed that not only she has the same type of sword as her father, but also the skills. She says that she wants to be stronger and they continue their lessons. Meanwhile, Fate is complaining to Mine they have been walking for a while since the last town. He's confused about this place and notices that it's full of ruins. Mine replies this is where she born. Fate is confused, but she explains further. She was taken to the imperial capital after she was born, and she doesn't have memories of this place, but still, this is an important place to her. Fate is confused and asks if Gallia wasn't destroyed 400 years ago, but Mine ignores and walks away. She stops at a random site, mentioning she found it. Fate is confused, but when he looks ahead, he sees some sort of cocoon. Greed even mentions he cannot believe one of those things are still alive. Mine starts walking again and Fate follows her while asking Greed, "What is that?" Greed replies it's a chimera. It's a military weapon created in Gallia a long time ago by patching monsters as the core. Fate is confused, but Greed explains this is their greatest failure. They get near to it with Greed mentioning that he thought that every chimera was disabled. Mine then turns to Fate and mentions he will be paying her the favor. Fate is a bit shocked because they will have to defeat this. He checks its stats just to find out that its lowest stat is 14 million. He also notices the chimera's skills appear as error. Greed explains that it's unstable because the monster's skills are artificially mixed. Despite the huge stats Mine mentions, this is still a child chimera, so it should be possible to defeat it. Fate is confused and asks what he should do. Mine replies that chimeras won't die by just simply being beaten. As long as it has a soul, it will always stay alive. Fate realizes that she needs his gluttony, soul-eating ability to deal with it. She replies with yes, mentioning it's the most sinful power to defy God. Without waiting, she jumps, saying they will be starting. She strikes the egg and we see a girl inside. Suddenly a monster comes out and Fate notices the girl in the monster's chest. He notices how her eyes looks just like his, but Mine says the monster is trying to intimidate him. Greed even tells Fate to look the other way, otherwise he will lose his will to fight. Fate asks Mine who's the girl, and she replies it's the chimera's core. In short, Mine reveals she needs him to give the finishing blow to the core. Fate tries, refuse it by explaining that if he eats her soul, the girl will be suffering in eternal hell. Mine tells him to not be deceived, because the girl is a monster in human form. She then says that his sentimentality will lead to his own death. The monster roars and Mine grabs Fate to dodge the attack. The monster summons lava and Fate asks Greed to become a scythe and cut it. Greed refuses because he cannot cut that attack. Mine then suddenly stops and tells him to stay behind her. She slashes the lava and stops the attack. She then claims they must split up and slices the monster's arms. Fate tries to stall time by using his petrification arrows, but Greed tells him to focus because the monster is already regenerating. Fate is confused, but Greed explains chimeras were built to fight independently for eternity. Fate doesn't know how they can even defeat it, but Mine slices the monster's arm again. He notices how she's more powerful than before, and Greed explains it's all about her weapon Sloth. The more she swings Sloth, the stronger and heavier it gets. The chimera shouts in pain, and Fate starts to feel some heavy pressure. Mine lands next to him, explaining the chimera is trying to evolve. Suddenly, wings appear from the chimera's back. Mine orders Fate to stay behind her back, and he gets reminded of Roxy. He realizes that he's being protected again and feels disgusted with himself. He proudly said that he wanted to help Roxy, but in the end, he's always being protected by someone. He wants to change and become stronger, so he tells Mine that he's going to unleash his half-starvation mode. Mine simply replies that if he makes a mistake, he will be swallowed by the gluttony. Fate knows it, but he doesn't care. He cannot help her if he doesn't activate it. He activates his skill and tries his best to control it. However, that comes with a big pain. The chimera doesn't wait and attacks, but Mine blocks it. Suddenly, she hears Fate's voice mentioning it's time to strike back. The chimera attacks with feathers that will explode on contact, and Fate decides to use them to their advantage. He uses greed to cut the feathers and create an explosion. He then leaps into the air and turns greed into a bow. He used the dust cloud to charge greed with 10% of his stats, plus sandstorm magic. Upon shooting, the chimera gets petrified. Mine uses this chance to attack and unleashes Sloth. Her attack is so powerful that she cuts the chimera's feet. Greed tells Fate to hurry up and attack before it regenerates. However, the chimera activates a barrier skill. Fate decides to cut it using his scythe, but it does nothing. Greed orders him to find the flow of mana and hit the weak point. Fate quickly finds it and hits it, damaging the chimera's core. However, he notices the girl is looking away and backs away. He decides to avoid eye contact and leaps away, but that just allows the chimera to fly away. He lands and notices that his eye is bleeding. Greed explains his time is almost up. Since there isn't much time, Mine tells him to get on her weapon. He's confused, but she explains she will launch him into the air so that he can defeat the chimera before it regenerates. He follows her instructions and she throws him away. Still, this stupid dude accepts to be launched, but doesn't know how to defeat it. Greed gives him the promo of the day. For 20% of his stats, he can the second stage ultimate. Fate accepts the deal and the scythe evolves. Greed explains their target is the center of manas. Fate analyzes and finds out the center of mana is the girl. However, the chimera traps him inside its shield barrier. The chimera's plan is to burn itself and take Fate with it. Without much time, Fate starts spinning in midair, combined with flames, and pierces the girl. This creates a huge explosion, but something strange happens to him. First, his telepathy skill activates and he sees both the chimera core girl and Mine hugging each other. Second, his gluttony skill activates, but instead of the usual excitement, he feels lonely. Greed explains that's how it works. He reveals that the chimera core is an inferior version, but in the end it's one of Fate's sin. Meanwhile, Mine is simply watching the chimera core girl turn into stone and falling. Fate lands and approaches Mine asking if she knew the girl. Mine explains she has forgotten what happened a long time ago, but once they become a chimera, they must defeat them, because if they don't, more people will die. Fate starts to realize that he also could become a lunatic who goes on a rampage, so he decides to ask Mine for a favor. If one day he loses himself to gluttony, he wants her to kill him because he knows she's the only who can kill him if he goes berserk. Mine then walks towards him and hugs him. Fate is confused, but she explains that she will do it when it comes the time. Later, Fate mentions he will be heading to Babylon and asks about Mine. She mentions that she still has to build a village for her people. He's confused because he didn't expect that was a true story. However, she mentions she has a certain feeling about him. She mentions that Fate will be dead before they meet again. He's confused about it. Turns out that Fate decided to reset his stats to unlock Greed Shield mode. In short, his current stats are all back to 1, therefore she thinks he will die soon. He realizes his mistake and asks her help to hunt and raise his stats. However, she walks away and asks for money. He manages to reach Babylon a few hours later, but Greed is complaining because Fate is heading to the wrong gate. Fate turns away and asks if Greed has been here before. Greed confirms, mentioning his previous wielder was also a deadly sin user. They finally enter the city, but there's a problem. Fate is a glutton and the food prices are 5 times higher than the capital. The Holy Knights arrive at the same time, and Fate puts on his mask before he sees Roxy from a distance. Story continues. Fate explains that every type of warriors come to Babylon and can be from mercenaries who have a grudge against Holy Knights and even former Holy Knights. Greed then says that as long as he's strong, he will be forgiven. That's how Babylon works because they want anyone to help them defeat the monsters. Fate realizes this is the best place for him to stay. Meanwhile, Roxy meets another holy knight named Alistair. He claims to be honored to be working with her, the heir of Hart family. Roxy thanks him for taking care of Babylon after her father passed away. Alistair stays humble, mentioning he couldn't help her father despite being fighting beside him. He apologizes to her, and she asks if he was there during his final moments. Alistair confirms, and Roxy tells him to keep his head up because she's there to carry on her father's will. She promises that together they will protect the people from the monster's invasion. They shake hands, but Miria thinks that Alistair is looking at Roxy with a perverted look. She wants to save her because she considers Roxy's in danger, but Mugan stops her, mentioning she will lose her head. Roxy then turns to Mugan and Miria, saying they will be inspecting the town. Meanwhile, Fate is walking around while thinking about his finances. It costs 100 gold coins per day stay in and 1 gold coin for breakfast. Suddenly, Greed tells him to stop and look left. He sees a store display and Greed claims the scabbard is calling for him. Fate thinks it looks expensive, but Greed replies they can get money by beating monsters. The store owner comes out asking if Fate is looking for something. However, he suddenly starts to act like a freak, checking out Fate's cloak. He notices the burn marks and thinks it was caused by a fireball or a powerful heat attack. Fate is pretty impressed because the guy noticed it right away. Greed claims this guy is talented and they can trust him, but he's only interested in getting the scabbard. Fate gives in and asks how much the scabbard is. The guy replies that's just a sample and he can make one that fits the sword. Fate then handles Greed and asks what he can do. The guy checks the sword, mentioning he never saw one-handed sword like that. He calls Greed fantastic, making the sword get all cocky. The guy then starts to think what kind of scabbard he can make to match Greed. He has some idea, but it will cost 500 gold coins. Fate is shocked and refuses the deal by running out of shop. Greed simply tells him to hunt monsters and get some funds, but Fate still thinks 500 gold coins is a rip-off. He considers the princess and the city to be really high, and he doesn't think he should spend that much. He decides to head out and hunt some monsters when he's approached by some guys. They ask if he wants to join them in hunting monsters, since another pair of hands isn't too much. He asks if Fate wants to enlist the army as a volunteer, but Fate simply rejects it. He won't be joining any group. The group leader apologizes and wonders if Fate is a former holy knight because he wants to go solo. Fate is confused, but the guy simply mentions he never guessed it because he looks shabby. He apologizes as if he was afraid and walks away. Greed tells Fate that he needs to dress up properly, otherwise he will have to deal with people like that. Fate cannot believe he must dress up just for self-preservation. He claims that he will be getting something cool, but first they must hunt. After walking for a bit, he reaches a deserted piece of land. Greed explains that Gallia is just beyond the border. Fate complains about the smell, but Greed explains that's because there are dead monsters everywhere. Fate continues walking, but there's something strange in the air. Greed explains that spores. Fate is confused when he sees some moss on the rocks, but Greed explains their spores contain poison. He advises Fate to not breathing, but Fate complains that he should have warned him much earlier. Greed explains that if he inhales too much, the moss will grow roots inside Fate's lungs. Fate gets scared, but Greed simply replies this is Gallia. Fate continues walking, and Greed detects a small-scale stampede right away. Fate tries to look around but cannot find it. Suddenly some orcs appear in the horizon. Greed explains they're the most common monsters in Gallia and they use nature weapons. Greed identifies 50 monsters and tells that orcs are smart in attack and coordination. Therefore, Fate should treat it like fighting against people. Fate accepts the advice and decides to put what Aaron Barbados taught him into practice. He rushes it, but he suddenly sees one orc being headshot by an arrow. The group from before appears and starts the attack. Fate stops, thinking they were quicker, but Greed complains. He tells Fate to snatch their prey for the sake of his luxury. Fate tries to reason, mentioning it's bad manners to steal monsters from other people. However, Greed simply replies there's no rules or manners when it comes to monster hunting. Suddenly more orcs appear. Greed explains there are 2 squadrons of them as reinforcements. Fate is still acting like a good boy and thinks he can deal with them, since it won't be considered stealing. Greed uses this chance to mock Fate, calling him an ally of justice. Fate rushes him using his speed to get as close as possible, but the orc shoots some fire arrows. Fate turns Greed into a shield that destroys the arrows. Greed explains that this new form repels any physical and magical attacks. He asks Fate to praise him, but our boy tells him to shut up because they must battle. Fate doesn't know how he should approach the fight. Greed simply tells him to use the shield and smash the orcs. Fate then starts running with the shield in front of him. He blocks every attack and runs into the orcs, slicing them in half. Greed explains that shield bash it requires some strength to use it, but Fate already has it. Fate continues running into the orcs, slicing every orc around. By the end all his stats reach over 2 million once again. However, Fate is feeling surprised because his gluttony skill is not active despite defeating several orcs. Greed asks if the skill became quiet after he defeated Haniel. Fate confirms and thinks it's because he trained to control the skill with Aaron. Greed accepts the possibility and tells him to cut the ears and return to the city. Once he returns, everyone is shocked to see that Fate defeated that many orcs alone. He gives them to the clerk, who is also shocked. However, one of the guys from before accuses Fate of stealing their orcs. Greed mentions that Fate actually saved them, but the guy tries to take Fate's bags away. Fate breaks the guy's hand, but the rest of the group decides to attack him. They all gang on him at the same time, but Fate defeats everyone with a single punch. The group leader throws a dagger and attacks Fate, but our boy blocks it with the bag and kicks him on his family insurance. In the end, Fate gets a payment of 100 gold. However, Roxy gets inside and asks if he's the one who knocked down this whole group. Fate is shocked, but explains everything. Roxy realizes this was in self-defense, and Fate asks what she will do to him. Roxy claims he went too far, but she's responsible for the decline of security in Babylon because there is no holy knight to keep it on check. She decides to not only let Fate go, but the group of ugly guys will spend a night in jail for their misbehavior. Fate then realizes that he became taller than Roxy, but she asks if he hurt her. He replies that he did, but Miria complains that it's rude to wear a mask in front of Roxy. Roxy is fine with it, especially because Mugan claims that a mask can be an important piece of equipment. Fate thanks her and she asks his name. Fate replies he is Corpse. She asks him to not cause problems and to learn how to dress with style. Fate gets shocked to hear it and runs away and panic. Everyone is confused by this, especially Mugan. He claims that Fate looks weak, but he managed to beat everyone. Minutes later, Fate is walking on the street thinking that Roxy might hate him. Greed replies it's better than finding out his identity. The sword then takes advantage of Roxy's words to dress well and asks again for a scabbard. Suddenly, the guy from the previous store appears, mentioning that he heard that Fate managed to beat the ruffians. Fate sighs because people are gossiping, but the guy suddenly asks him to fight while wearing his clothes. Fate is confused, and the guy introduces himself as Jade, a craftsman. The guy explains he opened his shop 3 months ago and is still a nobody, so he wants Fate to use his equipment, therefore getting some sort of ads revenue. Jade explains he was looking for a great warrior to create this partnership, and since it's free gear, Fate accepts the deal. After some work, Fate now looks like Karido with a mask. However, Jade asks for 80 gold coins in return. Just like us, Fate is shocked. Jade then asks for 40 gold coins instead, but still he got scammed. Fate then decides to get some food and notices a bar filled up with people. Greed mentions the food there is delicious, but Fate just wants something cheap. He decides to walk away when suddenly a beautiful girl comes out of the bar. She looks at Fate and she suddenly feels an impulse inside him. He cannot take his eyes off her. Greed mentions he's getting the hang of it and the girl walks his way. The girl then calls by his name, mentioning she's been waiting for him. Fate is shocked because she knows his identity and name despite the mask. She laughs it out, saying they're both one of a kind. Fate realizes she's a deadly sin skill owner. She introduces herself as Eris the Lust. They get inside and she tells him to remove his mask because she can see through it anyways. Fate notices something happens when he looks at her in the eyes. She apologizes, mentioning it's an effect of her lust skill. In short, the skill makes everyone to fall in love with her. Fate asks what she means by stating that she was waiting for him. She reveals she's been watching him for a long time since he was in the capital. She explains she wanted to contact him after he awakened his gluttony skill. However, she didn't contact him before because she was waiting for him to meet Greed. Fate asks if she knows about mine too. Eris claims she doesn't know much about mine because she's a first-generation deadly sin owner. She explains that just like Fate, she's second-generation. Fate is confused, but she explains that she isn't in good terms with mine because she has more plot. Eris then thanks him for defeating Haniel, and Fate asks if she knows everything. She replies that she doesn't know who put the cocoon there. She then explains there's a lot more chimeras and it will be hard to deal when they evolve. She claims the Holy Knights will have a hard time to beat them. She then wants to talk with him about the main topic, and she explains that she has two identities. One is a deadly skill user, and the second is a guardian of the kingdom. In short, she holds the kingdom's interests above individuals when it comes to the future, and she wants the kingdom to prosper for the next 1,000 years, even if she suffers a defeat now. Fate asks what she is getting at. Eris replies that Roxy must die in the Gala expedition. Fate gets angry at Eris, but she asks if he knows about the hate phenomena. She explains that hate builds up when he defeats monsters and accumulates over a long period of time. In the end, that hate generates a crowned beasts, and that happens to humans too. Fate is confused, but she replies that hate is also accumulated by the people who have suffered. In this case, it's generated by oppression, discrimination, and poverty caused by holy knights. Roxy is the only holy knight who cares about people, so if she dies, it will create a huge amount of hatred, which will swallow all the other hate and give birth to a human being with a new power. And that being will give birth to those with superior skills to help the kingdom. Eris claims that Roxy's death will lead the kingdom to a bright future, but Fate gets angry denying it. He claims that no good thing will be created from Roxy's death. He walks away, but Eris reveals that nobody can stop it because the plans are already in motion. However, Fate doesn't care about the opponent or intentions. He will protect Roxy at any cost. Story continues. Sometime later, Roxy is told that they have lost contact with one of their squadrons in Gallia. Roxy has everyone prepared to rescue them as they will be going to Gallia immediately. Fate is back at the shop where Jade tells him that they need some material called duskstone to make a scabbard for his sword. It's a difficult material to get and its supply is controlled by the kingdom, so he has no clue when he will have more. Greed wants them to just get some themselves, so Jade tells them that duskstone can be found in Gallia. Fate looks at a map of where they're headed and it just so happens to be near Great Canyon, the same place Roxy is going. They are greeted by giant orcs upon arrival, so they use the shield to protect themselves. They use shield bash to destroy the hideous creatures, and Fate's gluttony skill is activated a ton of times. Near Roxy, they are having a hard time getting to the Great Canyon because compasses don't work there. They can't use the center of the stars either, so Myriad condemns the clouds for getting in the way. Luckily, they can determine the direction by the concentration of orcs. Since the word colony is at the southernmost point, as long as they follow where all the orcs are, they will eventually get there. There are more dangerous monsters out there though, so they must proceed with caution. Elsewhere, Greed praises Fate for learning that he needs to rest before entering another fight. During his rest, Fate strangely sees the girl that was inside the chimera. A terrifying noise doesn't allow him to hear what she is saying, and he quickly finds himself in a place, so that human tomato juice. There he sees his victims and he's pulled down by Hato. Fate wakes up, but has no clue what just happened. There is no time to think however, as he detects monsters nearby. Greed points out that they are not orcs. They are crowned beasts and more than one of them. Fate uses his night vision skill to reveal that the monsters are salamanders. Fate takes one down using his bow, but he notices that there is something weird about these monsters. They usually run after taking major damage and they aren't coming after them. For some reason they're still just going in the same direction and it's like they are being controlled by something. This is pretty strange behavior, so they decide to follow them. Back with Roxy, she is woken up when her group is attacked by several salamanders. They do major damage and Alistair apologizes since the monsters somehow broke through their defenses. Mugan just manages to save her from becoming barbecue, and there are enough of the powers of these crowned beasts. Maria is furious, so she attacks with her magical flaming sword, but it doesn't work at all. Roxy rushes to her side, but the two are quickly in danger. Luckily for them, Corpse arrives to save them. Mugan is very impressed with him, as Corpse uses the common sharp edge skill with so much force. After Corpse finishes off the lizards, Roxy thanks him. She wants Maria to thank him too, but the little brat says that she didn't ask for help. They all introduce themselves. Maria finally decides to thank her savior. Alistair thanks him as well, but Corpse is just curious about a strange mark on the salamanders. All the salamanders have the same marking, and they point out how crowned beasts don't usually team up like that. They were clearly targeting Roxy, but she says that it could have just been a coincidence. Things have gotten very strange lately, especially after the divine dragon came out of its nest. Sometime later, they all finally arrive at the Great Canyon. Corpse thanks them for helping him get there, and Roxy is quite happy that they had the same destination. Maria as a jealous little brat and takes Roxy away since they need to rescue the squadron. Roxy tries to say goodbye, but Fate hesitates to take her hand because he doesn't want his mind-reading skill to activate. Maria takes his hand instead and they can hear her thoughts. The little brat doesn't want him getting any ideas about getting close to Roxy and wishes that he would just leave already. Roxy gets her to stop touching her man and everyone says their goodbyes. Fate seems oddly okay, which is letting her go even though he knows that she is in great danger. Either way, Fate ends up in a seemingly purified area in Gallia and notices the monsters there are petrified. It's almost like a graveyard, and Fate, stunned when he sees himself petrified, he just imagined that those, so they continue their search for the Duskstone. They don't find any yet, but they do spot Eris there. Fate immediately loses her, but turns to shockingly find a chimera. There is no core inside it though, so Greed assumes that it's just a prototype. It was buried in battle long ago and the rocks that covered it crumbled. There are some empty spots near it, so it seems like some chimera were awakened. 3 in total, so Fate wonders if Eris is responsible. An explosion shakes the ground, and it seems to have come from Roxy's direction. Fate rushes to her, and we see that her group is fighting against a terrifying chimera. Their power is overwhelming, but Corpse once again arrives to help them. His arrows don't really seem to be hurting them too much, and Roxy explains that Mugan and Alistair were both injured protecting Miria. These chimera are able to heal, but Great points out that it's much slower than Haniel's healing was. Corpse explains to the others that their opponents are chimera and their cores are the weakness. Corpse recruits the help of the 2 girls and they prepare to attack. The chimera tried to push them back with fire, but Fate just so happens to have fire resistance. One stupid chimera tries to hide its core with its arms, but our heroes are too smart for that. Corpse shouts one of them down and Roxy destroys its core. Corpse admires the apple of his eye and notices that she used Aaron's swordsmanship. Miria counters a fire attack from one of the chimeras with her sword, but screams in terror as she thinks she's going to die. Greed is impressed with the young lady and of Corpse finally arrives to relieve her of her terror. She hates having to be saved by him again, but thanks him properly this time. Roxy has Miria take everyone to safety and proclaims that Corpse and herself will take care of the remaining chimera. Our boy breaks out his scythe and the pair use the same technique they used on the first chimera to attack the others. This is Fate's first time fighting alongside Roxy, but it feels way more natural than with mine and Aaron. There is only one chimera left now, but it can surprisingly fly. They plan to attack it when it lands, but the second it does, the ground collapses. Corpse takes a hold of Roxy and assures her that she will be safe in his hands. Roxy quickly trusts him and they hold each other as they fall. Sometime later, Fate wakes up and quickly begins to panic when he realizes that Roxy is on his lap, but he has lost his mask. Roxy wakes up, but her boy finds his mask at the very last second. Corpse impresses her with some sweet fireball magic and he thinks about how close that was. Roxy explains that they weren't able to save the squadron since they arrived to find that they were all burned to unaliveness. Roxy points out that Corpse seemed to know quite a bit about the chimera, so he explains that he was told by a Gallian survivor. Roxy recalls seeing a Gallian girl with a large X and wonders if that's who he is talking about. She also heard rumors that this girl sent a lord flying, but our boy just plays dumb. Roxy explains that she also heard that this girl was traveling with a man wearing a skull mask, so our boy has no choice but to confess. Roxy just teases him and explains that he reminds her of someone she knows. She says that this guy should be in the capital right now, but she feels as though he is right there with her. Being apart from him has made her think about a lot of things and she wonders if he is happy. Corpse surprises her when he tells her that he is sure this guy is happy even though he isn't supposed to know anything about him. Corpse plays it cool though and says that this guy is a lucky man to have her care that much about him. Corpse is glad to see that Roxy hasn't changed at all, but he instantly feels a sharp pain. He can't understand why his gluttony skill is acting up at a time like this, and Roxy wonders what is wrong with his eye. Corpse doesn't want her to see his monstrous side, so he takes off running. Things couldn't get any worse as Fate can smell that a certain scent is close. It's the chimera and it comes bursting through the cave wall. Fate brings out his scythe, but imagines Roxy in the place of the chimera's core. He still attacks the core violently and demands that Roxy stop looking at him that way. The fight is over and Fate notices a mark on the chimera. It's the same mark that was on the salamanders, so Greed is certain that someone is targeting Roxy's life. Fate recalls so Eris wants to take Roxy's life and is determined not to let her go through with her plan. Roxy arrives late to the party and the cave collapses a bit. Duskstones just so happens to perfectly be right there, and Roxy explains that this crystal is formed from monsters. Roxy reunites with her group and they're glad to see that everyone is safe, except for the entire squadron that was brutally burned to death. Elsewhere, we get a quick look at some cool-looking blonde version of Corpse with a glowing green eye. Story continues. Roxy surprisingly tells Corpse to draw his sword and challenges him to a fair duel. Of course, Corpse has no clue why she would say this, but Miria tells him to stop acting so innocent. She reveals that he has a huge criminal record, 56 incidents of violence with other warriors and 20 cases of destroying property. Corpse explains that those were all cases where someone came at him, but they don't want to hear any excuses. Roxy refuses to allow any violent acts to go unpunished, so Corpse wonders what he can do. Roxy reveals that he only has one other option, and that is to join the royal army. Once he does, then even the rowdiest of warriors won't want to mess with him. Corpse explains that he doesn't like being a follower, and Greed agrees that Fate needs his freedom to be happy. Roxy explains that if he is choosing to refuse, then he will need to reflect on his actions in a jail cell. Corpse refuses that as well and draws his sword instead. Roxy points out that his scabbard will break if he fights with it on, but Corpse isn't worried since it's specially made. The two begin fighting, and it becomes very clear that Roxy will not be holding back. Corpse determines that he should have the edge in terms of stats, but he isn't able to overpower her for some reason. Greed explains it is to be expected of a holy knight like her. Her technical skill came from daily training. Corpse isn't startled when it becomes obvious that she is targeting his mask. Roxy explains that if he isn't going to take their fight seriously, then she will simply expose his identity. She nearly chops off his head with an attack, and she tells him that if he doesn't want to get exposed, then he needs to get serious. Corpse dodges just that and shocks everyone when he prepares to use the Holy Sword technique skill. He isn't supposed to be able to use it without a Holy Sword, so he reminds them that his scabbard is specially made. It's actually a weapon add-on that improves Holy Sword techniques made from the magic crystal he gathered at the Great Ravine. Roxy wonders if he was a former holy knight, but he isn't the same person anymore and says that he is just a warrior now. He begins his powerful attack, and it becomes clear to everyone, including himself, that he's about to win. However, Justin Faith sees that Roxy created a necklace from the gemstone he gave her. This fool gets way too distracted, so Roxy uses the opportunity to knock his sword away. Greed spins rapidly and calls Fate an idiot for not focusing. Corpse admits that he lost, but Roxy wants to know why he suddenly eased up. He acts like he has no clue what she is talking about, and she wonders if Corpse learned his fighting style from Sir Aaron. The way he strikes and his footwork reminds her of Aaron's. Roxy remembers the Aaron spoke of a traveler that had power so great as to cause him difficulty. She wonders if that was Corpse, but Corpse tells her that none of that matters. All she needs to focus on is being able to protect herself and Gallia. Corpse begins to leave and thinks about how kind she is, since even though she is in danger, she is thinking about him. Mugan then talks to him about the chimeras that were being controlled. It was strange to see when being controlled by another monster, and Mugan explains that his family has studied Lost Gallian and technology for generations. Corpse recommends that Mugan have his daughter examine a chimera, but Mugan assumes that Corpse is just trying to meet her. Mugan thinks he has bad intentions and promises never to let a guy like Corpse date her. Elsewhere, we see his daughter named Lane. She is told that the Valerics are going through some serious stuff after Hato died. Rumors say that Raphael has locked himself in his room to study the Philosopher's Stone relentlessly. Lane looks it up and finds that the Philosopher's Stone is able to heal any wound. It can also grant its owner great power. However, in exchange, it dominates the mind and body of the owner. At home, Fate has a memory of something Mind told him. She explained that Fate should aim for something called the Domain of E. It's the level of power that the Divine Dragon is at, and if you can't make it there, he won't be able to fight it. The only problem is that if he pushes too hard, his skill will overwhelm him and Fate will lose control. Just then an alarm sounds, and Alistair informs Roxy that a massive stampede, also known as a death march, is underway. Roxy plans to intercept it and tells troops to prepare to march to Gallia. Fate goes see the death march for the first time and sees that Roxy has arrived with the royal army. Greed, always the smart mouth, wonders if Fate intends on playing the hero once again. Fate is certain that Roxy can handle the situation, but wants to be ready just in case. He enters half-starvation state, and Greed points out that he is able to control it much easier than before. Just then Greed reveals that something's approaching the royal army from the east. This thing is moving through the ground, the way a whale swims. It is huge, and if it continues on its path, it will end up right beneath the royal army. They are distracted by the death march and are very susceptible to a surprise attack. Fate has Greed turn into a bow and uses his Gluttony skill to amplify the charge to give it twice as much range. It's a modified attack only usable in half-starvation status. Greed compliments him on the attack, and the creature reveals itself. This thing is a huge slime monster, and it has the same emblem as the other controlled monsters. Fate decides to find out what's behind it all and prepare to attack. His analysis reveals that this crowned beast has stamina, magic, and spirit stats all over 10 million. Greed points out that even a holy knight would lose to this thing and quickly changes into a shield to protect Fate from acid rain. Greed warns that Fate will die if it touches him, but that means he won't be able to fight up close at this rate. Even if he manages to cut it, that will only cause acid to spray everywhere, melting Fate along with it. Fate decides to give Greed 10% of his stats and use an arrow with fire on it in the hopes that it will evaporate the monster. Unfortunately, the slime creature managed to split itself in half and partially avoided the attack. It dives into the ground again and heads directly for the royal army. Fate chases after it, but slimes some of its babies that popped out of nowhere first. This was a pretty advanced technique and not likely one that some dumb slime monster would use on its own. Fate then finds a spot where the creature would have to come out of and prepares to destroy the core. He gives 20% of his deaths this time to create a more powerful attack. Greed is stunned since Fate wants to use a move they never even practiced before, but Fate fires the arrow anyway. Just before the monster is hit, something else seems to hit the slime first. Fate has no clue what that was, but it's glad to hear his gluttony skill activate. Shockingly, the slime is still alive, which Fate can understand since he took his soul. Just then Fate sees someone is watching him and they're wearing a perception-altering mask just like he is. Fate assumes it's Eris and attacks, hoping to expose her. Greed realizes that this person has a weapon of mortal sin and it's a black gun sword indie. Greed explains that the slime was hit with something before and it was some kind of magic bullet that draw out latent power. That is why the slime is still alive without a core. The core itself became capable of splitting up, which it did to survive. This thing is even more of a threat now as it's capable of infinite replication. The slime consumes Fate. Greed fears that he has done for. Luckily, Fate emerges soon after and Greed realizes that he must have already figured out the slime's corrosion magic. The slime won't be a match for him any longer and he goes to confront the mystery person. His gluttony skill activates, but Greed warns him not to overdo it. If his stats spike too suddenly, it can drive his skill into overdrive. Before that happens though, Fate is determined to take Eris down. He launches an arrow, but it's quickly deflected. Greed reveals that Fate has achieved stats as far as a human can go. Now he needs to reach in human heights the domain of E to go any further. This can only mean that Fate's attack failed because the person he is fighting has already reached the domain of E. Fate attacks with rage, but the mysterious person tells him that he is just wasting his time. Fate realizes that it's not Eris and this person is clearly a guy. This guy fires from his weapon, so Fate quickly pulls up a shield. Unfortunately, Fate still takes damage and he realizes that this guy is so much stronger than him. The guy approaches Fate to finish him off, but Fate refuses to give up. He reminds himself that he's willing to die and kill no matter what the price. The guy is just about to fire at point-blank range, but Fate demands that his gluttony skill give him the power he needs. Both of Fate's eyes turn red and the mystery man is shocked to see that Fate has achieved the domain of E. Fate is super confident now and thanks to Guy, since if he didn't run into him then he wouldn't have achieved this new level of power. Fate goes on the offensive and completely ignores the slime now. The guy tries to shoot some more, but they can easily see the attacks coming now. He avoids them all and creates a smoke screen. Fate finally manages to destroy the guy's mask and shockingly finds that it's Alistair. He strangely states that Fate is half right in calling him Alistair, but refuses to explain why. Instead, he starts playing a flute. Fate wonders what the heck this guy is doing, but Alistair explains that he will see soon. Just then Fate is stunned to see the divine dragon approaching. It's headed directly for Roxy and Alistair points out that it will get to her in the next 30 seconds. This psycho states that he and the divine dragon will give everything they have to kill Roxy, so he wants to see Fate of everything he has to stop them. He fired several shots of Fate while the slime corner him. Greed points out that Alistair is just trying to buy time, so Fate just rushes past everything. The divine dragon terrifies everyone when it finds Roxy, but she stands before it and asks her father to lend her his strength. She instantly regrets her decision not to run as a dragon releases its powerful attack and everyone is concerned for her. Lucky for Roxy, however, Fate has arrived to rescue her for the millionth time. The powerful dragon uses another insanely powerful attack, so Fate does his best to stop it again. He refuses to let it harm Roxy, but his mask is completely destroyed without even turning around. Roxy begins to wonder if he is Fate. Fate can't keep it a secret any longer. He turns to Roxy and greets her as Fate for the first time in a very long while. That brings the episode to an end. Thanks for watching. Want next part? Subscribe the channel and turn on notification bell.